Chapter 521. Covering the sky with one hand. A palm really fell from the sky. It was unimaginably huge, covering the sky and the sun. It was as if at that moment, not only the back garden, but the entire house, the long street outside, and even the nearby large area of the immortal city had suddenly darkened. It was like the wrath of the gods in heaven, with a ruthless and unparalleled power, descending from the sky and suppressing everything. The black shadow that soared into the sky from the back garden suddenly lost all escape routes, and was faced with endless darkness. And on the ground, all the Fuyunji experts who had reacted at the first moment and were ready to fly up and intercept the escaping black shadow, at this moment, one by one, stopped in their tracks and looked up at the sky with awe. That tall and burly figure that was like a god, unknowingly, was already standing in the sky, at the peak of the clouds, looking down at the world, high and mighty. The black shadow that originally soared into the sky with a trace of desperation and madness, fell into a predicament where there was no way forward or retreat. There was no way up to the sky and no way down to the ground. In the last moment of despair, he let out a long roar, and used all his strength to collide with the giant palm that was descending from the sky. The wind and clouds suddenly became urgent, the wind whistled from all directions, and the dark clouds in the sky rolled. Suddenly, there was a sound of thunder, and a bolt of lightning that tore the sky apart appeared between the fingers of the giant palm. Like a long white snake, it slithered on the giant palm, and then revealed a ferocious and disdainful grin at the black shadow that was rushing towards it. In an instant, the light of the lightning flourished, and the heaven and earth were silent. The giant palm came crashing down, bringing with it rolling wind and thunder, and slapped on the black shadow that soared into the sky. There was only a roar, and there seemed to be a wave of air that instantly burst forth in midair, and immediately rushed towards the surroundings like a huge wave. The giant palm lifted slightly, and paused in midair for a moment. And under the shadow of the giant palm, the black shadow, as if it had suffered a heavy blow, its entire body flew backwards, like a falling stone, flying diagonally faster and faster. In a short moment, it heavily smashed onto the ground, making a loud sound, and then there was a burst of rustling sounds. The black shadow couldn't control its momentum at all. It tumbled on the ground, smashing through 3 or 4 houses and even leaving a deep mark on the ground. If it was an ordinary person, they would have been smashed into smithereens. However, reality was not like that. But under such a terrifyingly powerful palm, no matter how high the black figure's cultivation was, he was instantly defeated. He fell in the ruins and never got up again. The experts of the Floating Clouds Agency, who were originally in the back garden, rushed over. In just a few moments, they had surrounded the black figure. All kinds of dazzling techniques were used, and in an instant, the black figure was suppressed to the point where he couldn't move at all. With that, the outcome was set. The final thief was finally caught. The members of the Floating Clouds Agency all revealed excited smiles. Even more people raised their heads to look at the sky. When they looked at the godlike figure high up in the sky, their faces revealed expressions of reverence. And the bald burly man above the clouds, at this moment, his expression was calm. He only indifferently glanced at the chaotic situation on the ground, then slowly raised his eyes and looked towards the distant horizon. He frowned slightly as if thinking about something. On the ground, Shui Ying and Lu Chen, who stood behind the crowd, didn't rush up to surround and interrogate the black figure like the others. Instead, they stood there without moving, their expressions a little strange. After a moment, they seemed to look at each other at the same time, but didn't speak. They just stood there silently. Lu Chen also frowned slightly. This black figure's cultivation was profound and his strength was valiant. He was a strong enemy that was difficult to deal with. But if everyone's target was the ghost elder who had fought with Supreme Tianlan and Fuyunji in the Immortal City for decades, it seemed to be a little weak. Was the ghost elder only at this level? Or could it be that this time, that crafty and treacherous old turtle was once again hiding in some dark corner, continuing his evil deeds? The battle between the evil cult and the Fuyunji was still not over, it was still going to continue painfully like this. In the underground city that was shrouded by the blood-red brilliance of the blood moon, Supreme Guyu expressionlessly walked out from the big house. Standing at the door, he paused for a moment. As if he sensed something, he raised his head and glanced at the sky. What entered his eyes was a strange blood moon that was surrounded by red light and shadows. But his gaze didn't seem to stop at that thing. After pausing on the blood moon for a moment, he looked further away. Passing through the blood moon was a solid and thick rock wall, and further away was the ground of the human world. That place seemed to be another world, and above it was a layer of real sky. The wind and clouds swirled. The person whose power shook the four directions was standing above the 9 heavens. Supreme Guyu's expression at this moment became somewhat complicated. He seemed to be deep in thought, and then quietly sat down on the stone steps at the door. In the huge city, on the long and empty streets, there was only his figure, looking like a lone shadow, extremely lonely. The blood light floated, sprinkled on his body, and also into the house behind him. In the backyard separated by a wall, in the dried-up well, a shadow hidden in the deepest part of the darkness slowly moved. He raised his head and glanced at that small well, and heaved a long sigh of relief. Then he seemed to hesitate, but in the end he still stood up, using his hands and feet to pat the hard walls of the well. His entire body then quietly climbed up the well wall. There was no sound of wind as the figure moved, no movement at all. This black figure silently and slowly climbed to the mouth of the dry well. The blood moon in the sky sprinkled down blood-red light, onto the well, onto his body. The red light floated up and down, like waves in a blood ocean, clustered his figure in the light and shadow. That black shadow let out a low sigh of satisfaction, deeply breathed in this air that even the smell seemed to carry the stench of blood, and then looked up at the blood moon in the sky, and slowly poked his head out. In the red blood light, the face that poked out of the well was impressively a sinister mask. Only the 2 eye sockets were 2 holes, and 2 dark red lights could be seen flickering in them. Not far away, outside the door separated by a wall, Supreme Guyu also quietly sat, looking up as if he did not feel anything. In that small house on the long street of the immortal city, the doors and windows were opened. Tai Hu Tru and Song Wenji stood in front of the window, and saw the entire scene in the sky. When the gigantic palm with unparalleled power defeated the black shadow that soared to the sky, True Lord Tiehu frowned, while Song Wenji, who was standing beside him, revealed a complicated expression. A trace of reverence first appeared in the depths of her eyes. Perhaps that was the feeling of every cultivator when facing such a powerful force that stood at the peak of the human cultivation world. Then she revealed a trace of worry, and turned to look at Supreme Tai Hu Tru. Supreme Tai Hu Tru seemed to feel the worried gaze of his goddaughter, and turned to her, forcing a smile. Song Wenji was a little hesitant, but finally said in a low voice, "Godfather, Supreme Tian Lan He, is very strong." Supreme Tai Hu Tru was silent for a moment, and suddenly sneered, his face revealing an arrogant expression, and said, "Not bad, but at my level, who cannot do this? This person is frivolous, and purposely wants to show off to the world, for an undeserved reputation, and is only SOSO. After speaking, he turned and walked away. Song Wenji took one last look at the figure in the sky outside the house. The corner of her mouth slightly revealed an imperceptible smile, and hurriedly followed Supreme Tai Hu Tru. Chapter 522. Chen He, who was in the crowd, squeezed through the people around him and walked out. His face was ashen as he turned to look at his surroundings. He quickly found Shui Ying and Lu Chen, who were standing behind the crowd and had not come over to join in the fun. He stood where he was and hesitated for a moment. Then he walked over with an ugly expression. He even had to take a deep breath to calm himself down before saying to the 2 of them in a deep voice, "That is not Elder Gue." Shui Ying and Lu Chen looked at him and did not say anything. After a moment of silence, Chen He said, "That person is called Fan Tui. He is the leader of the demon sect in the Western continent. He has been doing well over the years and is highly regarded by Elder Gay. He was deployed to the Celestial City with the intention of nurturing and putting him in an important position." Chen He did not finish his sentence because the outcome was right before his eyes. Clearly, this high-ranking member of the demon sect, Fan Tui, was very unlucky. It was an important opportunity for him to achieve meteoric success. However, he had coincidentally encountered a series of heavy blows to the demon sect from Fuyunji. It was naturally impossible for him to achieve his ambitions now. He was even forced to hide here and was eventually captured alive. It could be said that he was unlucky. However, there was no joy on the faces of Lu Qin and Xue Ying. The two of them looked at each other and saw a hint of worry and disappointment in their eyes. Their most important and biggest target, Elder Gue, who was the key to completely destroying the demon sect, where was he hiding? Could it be that this sinister and cunning enemy, who had fought with the people of Fuyunji for decades, would still be pestering Zheng Xianmeng in the Celestial City? Even though Perfected Lord Tianlan had clearly held back and did not kill Fan Te, it was not easy to fall into the hands of a divine transformation stage Perfected Lord, someone who had the power to be Zheng Xianmeng or even the most powerful person in the world. Fan Tue faced this divine transformation stage Perfected Lord head-on and was defeated on the spot. Even though he did not die on the spot, his internal organs were shaken and his meridians were in a mess. He fainted on the spot and remained unconscious for 3 days and 3 nights. During this period, Fuyunji had brought people back to Mount Tianlong. Of course, it was not just Fan Tue. There were also other demons from the demon sect that were captured in the house. Harboring evildoers of the devil cult was a serious crime. Of course, the owner of the house had to be held accountable, because it was very likely that the owner of the house was inextricably linked to the devil cult. He might even be a member of the devil cult. Due to various reasons, the original owner of the house disappeared from sight, and all the blame was placed on a man named Lu Hu. Everyone soon discovered that this man had died in that fierce battle in a corner of the house. Then, everything was perfect. The only and had not, had, the demon sect and had, and had, had, and had, had, and had, and had, and had. In the end, the demon sect was still weak. Given the situation, those who had escaped would not be able to overturn the situation. After this vigorous but peaceful encirclement, peace was restored on Mount Tianlong. After all, without capturing Elder Ghost, it could not be said that the evil cult had been completely destroyed. Therefore, the original days were still going on as usual. At most, there were more people in the prison who were prepared to interrogate and investigate. However, in Zheng Xianmeng, there were still some changes that were discovered. The relationship between the two major factions in Zheng Xianmeng, the Heavenly Law Hall and Fuyunji, seemed to have eased recently. Although the two high and mighty perfected cultivators in the divinity transformation stage did not show up and directly say anything, smart people and conscientious people were the last things that were lacking in such a powerful organization as Zheng Xianmeng. They had been paying attention to the situation in the Alliance of Immortals all the time, carefully searching for every opportunity and trend that might affect them. And for so many years, the news in Zheng Xianmeng could not be completely kept secret. Everyone felt that it was like a sieve that leaked information everywhere. In fact, it was indeed a sieve. Speaking of which, it was a very interesting thing. Even if one was as strong as a perfected lord of the soul formation stage, even if his name shook the world and his prestige shook the celestial city, no matter how strong he was or how powerful he was still powerless against things like rumors. This was probably the reason why the human heart could never be controlled. But fortunately, there were too many smart people in this world. Since they could not control the rumors, they would instead add vinegar to the rumors and release more confusing words that made it difficult to distinguish between truth and falsehood. Naturally, they could also make people confused and at a loss for what to do. Therefore, during this period of time, Mount Celestial Dragon looked peaceful, but the rumors in private were like waves, coming wave after wave. Today, it was the Fuyun division that suffered a great loss and was fooled by Elder Ghost, so they didn't manage to catch the culprit. Tomorrow, it was the true Lord Tianlan's ingenious plan and meticulous arrangement that defeated the last force of the devil cult in the Celestial City in one fell swoop. The day after that, there was someone who stood out and said with certainty that the reason why this battle was so successful was because True Lord Tai Hu and True Lord Tianlan. disregarded their former enmity and cooperated with each other sincerely. As expected, these few deity realm true lords were all great figures who cared about the world and placed the righteous path of the world above all. The rumors were like a mess of flowers, clouding people's eyes. It was hard to distinguish between truth and falsehood. But during this period of time, it was true that perfected Lord Tai who did not open his mouth to criticize or berate Fuyunji. Those who thought that the two factions had reconciled also used this as evidence. But in this chaos, there was a small matter that did not attract attention. At most, it was a piece of news that people found a little strange and then forgot about after hearing it. It was said that perfected Lord Tai who had passed down an order to withdraw the dog ban that was previously issued. Most of the cultivators in the world did not keep dogs. Very few cultivators who kept pets had to keep all kinds of different kinds of strange birds and beasts. The remaining number was really pitiful. So, when this dog ban was first issued, although it was surprising, it did not cause too much controversy in the Celestial City. Everyone treated it as if it did not exist. But now that it was suddenly cancelled, everyone just listened and laughed. Most people did not care and just thought that it was a sudden impulse of that perfected Lord Tai who. In any case, if you cultivated to the realm of perfected Lord of Deity Transformation, of course you would be qualified to do this. However, only 4 people in this world knew that the reason why perfected Lord Tai who did this was because that day in the small house on the long street, after perfected Lord Tianlan and perfected Lord Tai who had reached an agreement on all the conditions, Lu Chen suddenly and very politely added this condition to perfected Lord Tai who. This suggestion seemed a little rude and unnecessary, but that was what Lu Chen said. And the strange thing was, perfected Lord Tianlan seemed to agree very much. Before perfected Lord Tai who lost his temper, he smilingly included this request in his own request, and also suppressed perfected Lord Tai who's temper. So, in the end, this huge pursuit ended silently. There was not much change in Lu Chen's life. The only one who benefited the most was a strong black dog. On that day, the black dog was released and no longer restrained by anyone. It stood in front of the Kunlun temple with a proud and ecstatic expression, barking wildly outside for the whole morning. It was said that the entire Sky Dragon Mountain could hear the dog's barking. Later, the black dog was kicked out of the Kunlun temple by perfected Lord Tianlan and was not allowed to enter again. Chapter 523. Although they did not manage to catch Elder Ghost in that arrest, but this operation was still like giving the evil faction, which was already on its last breath, a heavy stab, stabbing into the heart, hurting into the bones. From that day onwards, the ghost-like shadow that had been floating in the immortal city for many years finally quieted down. There was no more movement about the evil sect, nor any news related to Elder Ghost. Everything seemed to have sunk into the water, into the darkness, and from then on, there was no more sound. Most of the people thought that the evil sect's power was gone and there was no turning back. Shuiying, Lu Chen, Old Ma, and that Qinhe who sought refuge all thought so. All the power was wiped out, even if Elder Ghost was still on the run, even if he still had a little possibility to stir up some waves in the future, but to rebuild the evil sect in front of such a powerful Zhang Xianmeng was still too difficult. Sky Dragon Mountain calmed down. Of course, that was only on the surface. In the era of prosperity, the undercurrent under the huge organization would never stop. There would always be all kinds of things happening. After eliminating the foreign enemies, it was time for everyone to plot against each other for their own interests. No, it could even be said that this era had already arrived. Everyone was already very familiar with the open and veiled struggles. The only difference was that in the past, there was still Fuyunji. Because of the persistence of Lord Tianlan and some other reasons, he kept chasing and biting the evil sect like a mad dog. Relying on Lord Tianlan's rare talent, relying on Fuyunji's growing strength, and all kinds of ruthless and decisive methods, the evil sect was slowly suppressed, and Zhang Xianmeng won the reputation of the world. Now it was a new era. It was time to do something else. For example, they would stab their partners who were also allies of the Immortal Alliance and the Righteous Path with a smile, snatch their business, curse them, spread rumors, and then criticize them righteously. In the end, once they gained power, they would kill their friends. Finally, this era had arrived. Have you been waiting for this day for a long time, or have you been resisting for this day to come? That day, when Lu Chen and Lord Tianlan were chatting in the Kunlun Hall, he asked him directly. Lord Tianlan thought for a while, then said with indifference and arrogance, "Never thought about it. Anyway, with my current achievements, it should be others who plot against me, right?" Lu Chen did not believe a word he said. "Nonsense, I don't believe you when you say you don't plot against others." Lord Tianlan laughed and said, "Brat, can't you say something nice?" Lu Chen said, "Oh, Master is kind, humble and gentle. You should be careful of the people in the Celestial Alliance who have evil intentions and want to harm you. You can't underestimate them." Lord Tianlan clapped and smiled, nodded and said, "Well said." Lu Chen rolled his eyes and said after pondering for a moment, "What should we do next?" Lord Tianlan said, "That old tortoise is hiding somewhere right now and refuses to come out no matter what. It's indeed hard to find, but we can't just give up. Don't bother about this for now and leave it to Shui Ying and Fiyunji." Lu Chen nodded. Lord Tianlan continued, "I have something important that I need your help with, and it has to be you." When Lu Chen saw Lord Tianlan retract his smile and turn solemn at this point, he could not help but be stunned. He sat up straight and nodded. "What is it?" Perfected Lord Tianlan glanced out of the hall and saw Mount Sky Dragon standing tall and majestic under the clear skies. He narrowed his eyes slightly with a deep gaze. After a moment, he said, "Make a trip back to Kunlun on my behalf." The forest was quiet and the wind blew through the majestic mountain. In the quiet hall in the afternoon, there was only a soft and low voice that floated in the hall. It was like a strand of lonely wind that lingered and didn't fade away, and it was telling a secret that no one knew. Atsu lay lazily under the shade of a tree outside of Kunlun's hall. Its dog eyes were half closed and it looked like it was dozing off. However, when a familiar voice came from afar, Atsu's body quivered, and he immediately opened his eyes. His eyes were bright, and his drowsiness disappeared without a trace. Lu Chen stood on the stone steps and smiled at it, waving his hand. Atsu jumped up and ran over while barking. It rushed to Lu Chen's side and rubbed its head against his body intimately. Lu Chen patted its head and looked back at the majestic Kunlun's hall thoughtfully. A complicated expression appeared on his face. After a moment, Lu Chen said, "Let's go, Ats. We're going on a long trip." Since they were going on a long trip, it was impossible for them to leave just like that. Lu Chen first returned to his residence and tidied up before leaving for Fiyunji. It had been a long time since Atsu had followed him like this. However, this black dog did not seem to be unfamiliar to him. It ran back and forth and sniffed around, just like before. Lu Chen arrived at Fiyunji's hall and asked someone to inform him. Not long after, he saw Shui Ying. Shui Ying smiled when she saw him and said, "I haven't been here for a while. Let me tell you about catching Elder Gray. That old turtle is really cunning. I really don't know where he is hiding. However, we didn't come out empty-handed. 3 days ago." Lu Chen smiled and waved his hand. "Hall Master Shui, you can make the decision on this matter. I won't interfere. When it comes to dealing with the demonic cult, no one in the world can beat you. Even when Master ordered me to come over a while ago, it was just to help you from the side and help you balance the relationship with the new experts of the Kunlun party." Shui Ying was slightly startled. Her smile became even sweeter. She covered her mouth and said, "What are you saying? When did you learn to flatter?" Lu Chen laughed heartily and said, "Of course not. All right, I came here today to say hello to Hall Master. The cultivation method that Master passed on to me is quite difficult. In the next few days, I have to go into seclusion in Kunlun's hall. I'm afraid that I can't manage the affairs of the outside world for a while. I can only come and trouble Hall Master Shui." Shui Ying raised her eyebrows. She then nodded and said, "I see. Cultivation is the duty of us cultivators. Your future is boundless. You carry the expectations of the monarch, so of course you have to put this matter first. As for the other mundane matters, let me handle them. You can rest assured and cultivate." Lu Chen smiled and cupped his hands. "Thank you very much." The two of them chatted for a while and handed over some of the chores during the conversation. Lu Chen then took his leave, turned a corner, and found old Ma again. He told him exactly what he had said. Old Ma looked very envious. He smiled and said, "Go and cultivate well. Maybe when you come out of seclusion, you will amaze the world with a single brilliant feat." Lu Chen smiled and said, "How can that be possible? Anyway, buy more wine when the time comes. Let's drink together." Old Ma laughed and agreed. Lu Chen left with Atsu. Along the way, intentionally or unintentionally, he passed by the outside of Su Qingjuan's residence. His gaze fell on the door for a long time. But in the end, he walked over in silence. Just like that, he returned to Kunlun's hall. He brought Atsu and sat in a quiet corner. When night came, darkness came from all directions. In the silence, Lu Chen blended into the shadows of darkness that he had not seen for a long time. Chapter 524. There was the sound of even breathing in the darkness. Being immersed in a dream in the quiet night was also a kind of unremarkable but in fact very beautiful happiness. However, some people were destined not to want this kind of dream. Even in the dead of night, she was like a vigilant kitten, carefully on guard. Once there was the slightest movement, she would immediately wake up. White Lotus was this kind of girl. She quietly sat up in the darkness and turned her head to look out the window. The night was quiet and deep like the sea. There seemed to be nothing but darkness, but it also seemed that behind the dark deep sea, there were countless shadows and ghosts, staring at this place in the middle of the night. White Lotus gently frowned and then turned her head. She heard the steady and quiet breathing of Su Qingjun in the same room. She was still in a dream, quietly and gently sleeping. Although she had encountered those heart-wrenching and painful things, perhaps in the depths of her heart, there was still light. She did not carry too many secrets. Her heart did not have that kind of pressure that could make people go crazy. She lived in her own time, tasting the joys and sorrows of her own life. She slept very quietly and very peacefully. White Lotus quietly looked at her, a trace of envy flashing in her eyes. Then she gently got off the bed, quietly opened the door and walked out. White Lotus walked to the road outside the door. In the quiet night, there was no light in the surrounding houses. Only a few stars in the night sky shone a little light on the world. Bai Lian looked around, then looked in the direction of the Kunlun Hall. In the deep darkness of the night, a tall figure could be vaguely seen standing in the depths of the shadows, like a huge tree that could support the heavens and the earth in the darkness. White Lotus's body trembled and a trace of fear appeared in her eyes. In that instant, she seemed to have an impulse to turn around and run. But in the end, she still gathered her courage and slowly walked towards the darkness. The mysterious shadow seemed to be guiding this young girl in front. Her elegant and refined but slightly pale face was particularly eye-catching in the night. The darkness clustered around her, like evil spirits cheering and grinning, entangled, dancing and lingering. The young girl walked further and further away, gradually leaving the house and walked to an unknown hidden place. There was a forest around her, but through the gaps, she could still see the majestic Kunlun Temple. It was probably somewhere next to the Kunlun Temple. When the shadow suddenly stopped moving, the forest in the dark night suddenly quietened down. The insects and small animals that should have been under the grass and trees suddenly seemed to be suppressed by some power and no longer made any sound. White Lotus trembled even more violently. Perhaps she had never been so afraid of a person in her entire life, including her master, true Lord Bai Chen, who was once renowned throughout the world and had an unfathomable cultivation. In front of her, the shadow seemed to have covered her entire world. She had completely lost control of her life. Life and death, sorrow and joy, were all in the hands of this shadow. She looked at the shadow, then clenched her teeth and slowly knelt down, bowing her body to express her submission. She did not dare to reveal a trace of hostility and displeasure. With a trembling voice, she said in a low voice, "Martial uncle, are your injuries healed?" A deep man's voice came from the dark shadow, asking White Lotus. White Lotus bowed her head and said, "More or less healed. I was the one who asked Lu Chen to do this. Do you hate me or him?" White Lotus's body stiffened on the ground, then she said in a low voice with a trace of determination, "No, I don't hate anyone. I did these things willingly." The shadow moved, then slowly turned around. Under the faint light, the tall and burly figure of perfected Lord Tianlan was revealed. Even in such a dark corner, his big bald head seemed to stand out. This man, who stood at the peak of the entire human race, looked at the girl who knelt on the ground and did not dare to raise her head. There was a trace of contempt on his face, but it was unknown whether he was looking down on White Lotus's insincere words or indifferently looking down on all the people in the world. Perhaps he did not even bother to expose White Lotus's insincere words. He just gently waved his hand and said, "You did well last time. You would rather die than resist. It seems that your heart is still honest." Bai Lian's head touched the ground of the forest. Feeling the slightly moist and cold soil, she closed her eyes. After a while, she said softly, "Martial uncle, please do not worry. Bai Lian does not have any other intentions. I only want to be at Martial uncle's side, to charge and break through the enemy lines for you, and to do my best for your great ambitions. Even if my bones are crushed, I will not regret it." Perfected Lord Tianlan did not comment. His expression was also calm, and it was impossible to tell whether he was happy or angry. It was also impossible to tell whether he believed White Lotus's words. He just silently pondered for a moment, then said, "Not long ago, I asked Lu Chen to secretly leave the Immortal City and sneak back to Kunlun Mountain to do something for me. If you are willing, you can go with him." White Lotus's body trembled. She raised her head in astonishment, clearly not understanding the intention of Perfected Lord Tianlan's sudden request. However, Perfected Lord Tianlan did not intend to explain to her at all. He only said indifferently, "If Lu Chen asks, just say that it's my idea. Follow him along the way and chat with him more, provoke his dissatisfaction towards me. If possible, you can also instigate him to secretly harm me. In short, I don't care how sinister and malicious he is. Just go ahead and do it." Bam! White Lotus kowtowed heavily and said resolutely without hesitation, "I don't dare." Perfected Lord Tianlan glanced at her and sneered. "Do what I asked you to do." White Lotus felt as if her heart was about to jump out of her chest. She was extremely nervous. She stole a glance at the giant who was as terrifying as a mountain. Then, with a slight tremble, she slowly nodded. "After you return to the mountain, report to me no matter what happens along the way and any reaction from Lu Chen," Perfected Lord Tianlan said. White Lotus was silent for a moment before agreeing in a low voice. Perfected Lord Tianlan did not look at her anymore and turned to leave. However, he stopped very quickly and said, "There's one more thing. You can follow Lu Chen along the way, but you are not allowed to enter the Kunlun Mountain Forbidden Area." Kunlun Forbidden Area? White Lotus was shocked, but she quickly reacted and lowered her head in agreement. Perfected Lord Tianlan went straight away and did not look back again. Perhaps in his eyes, White Lotus was just a frivolous and insignificant person like a falling leaf. Bai Lian, on the other hand, maintained her position on the ground and did not move for a long time. After a long while, a sliver of strange joy suddenly flashed across her face in the darkness. She was an exceptionally smart girl. Even though there was a world of difference between her and that person, she could still clearly feel that this person who was so powerful and almost unparalleled in the world still had a weakness. He was too powerful, too smart, and could see through the feelings of the world too thoroughly. His treacherous methods were too thorough. Everyone in the world respected and worshipped him. Who didn't? However, he could no longer easily trust another person. Even though he was willing, liked, cultivated and chose such a successor, and he wanted to hand over all his properties to him, but he could not control his suspicions. The endless suspicions that he could not completely trust a person. It was a shadow that he could never get rid of in the darkness. It always entangled and followed behind that tall and burly figure like a venomous snake. From time to time, it revealed its sharp poisonous fangs and dripped transparent but fatal venom. Chapter 525. In the dead of night, darkness shrouded the earth. In the main hall of Kunlun, there was still some light because there were some everlasting lamps that were lit in several places. However, this light was very weak and could not illuminate too far away. It also could not shine on Lu Chen's body. The black dog was lying next to Lu Chen. It did not sleep as it usually did, but looked a little uneasy. From time to time, it would turn its head to look around, but most of the time, it would look at the tall lotus throne in the center of the main hall. Although there was no one there at the moment, in its eyes, there seemed to be some vigilance and even hostility. Perhaps the person who sat on it was too powerful, and one day, he was annoyed by the dog's barking and kicked it away. In contrast, Lu Chen was much calmer. He sat quietly with his eyes closed from beginning to end. It was not until late at night when everything was quiet that he opened his eyes. After looking outside the main hall, he said to Atsu, "Let's go." Atsu stood up, wagged its tail, and trotted towards the door. It did not seem to have any nostalgia for this place, and seemed to dislike it very much. Lu Chen also walked out of the main hall. The few spots of light in the main hall of Kunlun could not extend outside at all, so the darkness rushed in like a tide, crowding him in the shadows. Atsu turned its head to look at him. Perhaps because it was standing in the darkness, Lu Chen suddenly found that its eyes had turned into a light green again. It was a little different from when it came to Immortal City. The color was a little lighter, but it was clearer, like a gem that had a little dust on its surface, becoming more beautiful. He smiled and reached out to touch Atsu's head. Then he strode down the stairs and walked into the darkness of the night. In the conversation before he left, Perfected Lord Tianlan had already explained most of the things to Lu Chen. As for why he did not personally make a trip for such a confidential matter, Perfected Lord Tianlan also explained the reason to Lu Chen. He said that it was a critical moment in Zhengxianmeng where undercurrents were surging and danger lurked everywhere. He really could not leave and had to guard the situation here. Once he left the city rashly, a great change would probably occur. To this day, Zhengxianmeng had almost annihilated the devil cult and the world had submitted to him. Fiyunji's name was known throughout the world and everyone was in awe of him. Whether it was Zhengxianmeng or Lord Tianlan, their reputation and prestige were at the peak for the past hundreds of years. But now, Perfected Lord Tianlan said that danger lurked everywhere? But he said that a great change was about to happen? Lu Chen did not refute this nor did he ask further. He just calmly accepted this strange and important secret mission. Then, after announcing to the public that he was in seclusion, he quietly left the giant city where the center of power in the cultivation world was located. For many years, he seemed to be a person born in the dark. Whenever the night came, he would appear especially like a fish in water and could even do some things that ordinary people could not imagine. Of course, this night he would no longer transform into the cold, murderous shadow killer in his dusty memory. He just quietly took Atsu and hurriedly left the Immortal City. There were no accidents along the way and the journey was very smooth. Although it was not a particularly gratifying thing, the moment Lu Chen walked out of the Immortal City, he still felt a sense of relief. When he turned his head and looked into the distance, he suddenly realized that the city that was like a giant beast quietly creeping in the darkness of the night, he actually felt a kind of unconsciously tension and pressure every day he was in there. Lu Chen stood where he was for a while and then let out a long sigh. He turned around and called out to Atu, who looked far more excited than he was, who was happily scuttling through the bushes in the surrounding wilderness, sniffing and jumping madly. Lu Chen was about to continue on his way. But at this moment, Lu Chen and Atsu, who was running over not far away, suddenly sensed something and turned their heads to look at a certain place hundreds of feet away. It just so happened to be the border between the Immortal City and the outside world. Under the dim light and shadows of the night, a few figures suddenly soared into the sky and quickly descended. Then they started fighting fiercely in the darkness. The sound of weapons clashing, roars, cold snorts, and screams quickly spread out in the oppressive atmosphere. It seemed that a few people were besieging a young girl, and both sides were very fierce and decisive. Every time they attacked, it seemed like they wanted to kill the other party completely. Lu Chen frowned and looked over there for a while. At this moment, Atsu had already run to his side, and after a while, Lu Chen suddenly said in a low voice, "It seems to be White Lotus?" Atsu did not confirm or deny it. He tilted his head and stood there without moving, looking like he did not have the slightest intention of going over to help. Lu Chen thought for a while, and a look of hesitation appeared on his face. This timing was indeed a bit too coincidental. Nothing happened before, nothing happened after, But on the night he quietly left the immortal city, White Lotus also wanted to leave. And then be discovered and hunted down? After pondering for a while, Lu Chen shook his head, turned around, patted Atsu's head, and said faintly, "It has nothing to do with us, let's go." After saying that, he went straight away and didn't look at the fierce battle in the distance any longer. Atsu snorted, but turned back to look at White Lotus's fierce battle. But no matter how one looked at it, the dog's expression and gaze seemed to be somewhat gloating, as if it kept muttering in its heart, "Die, die quickly." After muttering a few words, Atsu ran away, and after a while, it caught up with Lu Chen in front, wagging its tail and looking particularly happy. A man and a dog walked into the distant night just like that. Cruel and unscrupulous. Bastard. Stinky man. In the midst of the fierce battle, White Lotus felt as if her chest was about to explode with anger. She glanced at the man and dog in the distance, mercilessly turning around and leaving. Then she thought about her mission of chasing after Lu Chen, and how she had even thought about secretly hinting at the possibility of getting along with Lu Chen. She felt extremely wronged. Well, the reason why she thought so was because she was not stupid. She could see that although Supreme Lord Tianlan still did not completely trust his disciple, Lu Chen was, after all, the only disciple he had personally chosen. The fundamental purpose of what he did was actually to dispel her suspicion, and then she could truly trust Lu Chen. Based on this alone, Lu Chen's position in the heart of the damn Baldi was incomparable. Because other people didn't even have the qualifications to make perfected Lord Tianlan suspicious. For example, she herself. Perfected Lord Tianlan wouldn't send someone to test her because he didn't care and didn't have the intention to trust her. She knew that Lu Chen's future might really be limitless. She knew that even though she had been a proud daughter of heaven since she was young, and that her talent was unparalleled, all of this seemed worthless in the face of true power and supreme figures. She really wanted to curry favor with Lu Chen, take the opportunity to quickly make friends with him, show kindness to him, and let him take care of her in the future. However, she did not expect that Lu Chen did not intend to come at all. "Does he look down on me?" White Lotus was a little frightened, and then it turned into anger. The surrounding killers were still fiercely besieging. White Lotus was angry, and her face was as cold as frost. She suddenly attacked fiercely, and at the same time, she gnashed her teeth and said, "Damn Baldi, you sent me to do something, but you didn't tell these lackeys. Are you deliberately messing with me?" Chapter 526. At daybreak, White Lotus finally broke through the encirclement. She was covered in blood as she fought her way out of the encirclement. She had shaken off the pursuers. She was exhausted and her whole body was in pain, but she couldn't care less at this moment. After confirming that she was temporarily safe, her first reaction was to start looking for Lu Chen's whereabouts. However, Lu Chen and the huge black dog had already disappeared without a trace. This was really a very miserable and unlucky feeling. White Lotus was so angry that she almost crushed her silver teeth. But obviously, even if she died of anger, no one would come to collect her corpse. So in the end, she could only swallow her anger and find a secluded forest to hide. Then, she began to treat her wounds and planned to rest for a while to recover her strength before continuing to look for traces of Lu Chen. Fortunately, she knew where Lu Chen's destination was. As long as she followed along the road to Mount Kunlun, she would probably be able to find him. This was also the only hope in this bad luck, but she didn't know when she could find him. Perhaps, when the time came, she could provoke him and make him fall out with Supreme Tianlan, destroying his future, making Supreme Tianlan suspicious of him, and it would be best if he killed him with his own hands. That would be the best. Thinking of this hatefully, White Lotus actually felt a little happy. She took off her coat and began to bandage her wounds. But at this moment, it could be seen that the battle she had experienced last night was really fierce. There were wounds on her front and back. Although they were not fatal or too serious, at a glance, the scarred appearance of this teenage girl formed an extremely harsh contrast with her elegant and refined appearance. It also made people want to sigh. Perhaps a beautiful fairy should stand high above the clouds, not eating the food of the mortal world, looking down on all living beings, and being admired and revered by people. And this girl in front of them was probably the unlucky one who fell into the mortal world and fell into the dust. So, someone really sighed. White Lotus's body tensed up and she suddenly jumped up. Her expression was tense, like a fierce and angry little beast. Her eyes were cold and sharp. Looking at the shadow behind the forest, she shouted in a low voice, "Who is it?" The grass and trees shook violently. Then, a black dog ran out from the shadows of the plants. It stood there and didn't come over. It just looked at White Lotus and barked. White Lotus was stunned for a moment, and a trace of astonishment flashed across her face. But somehow, her body slowly relaxed. A moment later, the shadow behind Black Dog shook and Lu Chen walked out. He stood there and looked at White Lotus. His gaze swept across the wounds on her fair skin. He shook his head helplessly and said, "Do you need my help? Scram." White Lotus sat on the ground, gnashing her teeth, her body trembling slightly. "I don't need you. Ouch, it hurts, to help me." "It's right that it hurts." Lu Chen sat behind her. Like magic, there were a lot of medicine, white cloth and other things around him. Then he treated the wound on White Lotus's back. At the same time he said, "At least they didn't put poison on their weapons. Otherwise, you would be in more trouble." White Lotus clenched her fists. Her face was so pale that there was almost no blood. It was obvious that she was trying her best to bear it. After a few breaths, she said angrily, "In any case, they are people of Zhengxianming. How can people of the righteous side poison?" "You are wrong." Lu Chen put down the blood-stained cloth in his hand. Then he took the medicine and gently sprinkled some white powder on White Lotus's wound. White Lotus's body trembled. She sucked in a breath of cold air. Her voice was hurried and she groaned a few times. But, in the end, she managed to hold it back. Lu Chen put down the medicine bottle and said, "When it comes to sinister methods like poisoning, there is really no one in the world who can compare to us Zhengxianming. Oh, especially in Fiyunji. That is a place where talents and experts gather. So, you were lucky to be able to escape last night." White Lotus was silent. She did not know why, but her eyes seemed to soften a little. Behind her, Lu Chen saw that the medicine powder had been integrated into the wound. Then he began to treat the other wounds. After a while, he finally finished treating the wounds on White Lotus's back. Although Lu Chen had always been a man with a heart of stone and was used to seeing blood and death, he could not help but frown when he looked at the girl in front of him. After a moment of hesitation, he said to White Lotus, "These wounds are many and deep. In the future, your back may have a lot of scars." White Lotus did not seem to care. She only sneered and did not turn around. She said calmly, "I also have a wound here on my chest. It can't be erased. Do you want to take a look?" Lu Chen was suddenly speechless. He looked a little embarrassed. He smiled bitterly and shook his head. He used a white cloth to gently wrap up the wounds on White Lotus's body. After everything was done, he stood up and turned his back to White Lotus. Soon, there was the sound of clothes being put on. Lu Chen suddenly saw Black Dog, who was lying not far away, suddenly raise its head and look behind him. Lu Chen glared at the dog. Atsu was shocked. It shrank its head and then lowered its head. Lu Chen was silent for a moment. He said slowly, "You should know in your heart that I will not tell you that I regret stabbing you." The sound behind him stopped for a moment. It was as if White Lotus's movement had stopped for a moment. After a while, White Lotus walked over after putting on her clothes. She looked at Lu Chen and said coldly, "Remember, I will return this stab to you sooner or later." Lu Chen nodded and said, "Okay, I will remember." There are probably no good people in Fiyunji, right? As she walked out of the forest, White Lotus looked in the direction where she came from. She looked at the vague outline of the giant city and said with disgust. Lu Chen walked past her and said, "The people who surrounded you last night were probably not from Fiyunji. Otherwise, you would have some troublesome things to deal with now. But, you are right." He nodded in agreement and said, "I also feel that there are not many good people in Fiyunji." White Lotus looked at him and said, "So after fighting with the demonic order for so many years, you are fighting poison with poison. What about you?" You are also a kind of poison, right? Lu Chen was silent for a moment and said, I am probably a kind of poison. White Lotus stared at him for a moment. She suddenly could not help but laugh. She shook her head and walked forward. She said, I don't know why my Shishu was blind. He actually fell for you and even accepted you as his disciple. I really don't understand. Lu Chen followed, smiled and said, Oh, so you don't think I can do it? White Lotus snorted and said, You're far worse than me. In terms of birth and talent, aren't I better than you in both? Lu Chen thought for a moment. He shook his head and did not speak. He only looked into the distance and smiled gently. He then asked, Oh right, looking at you, could it be that you chased after me last night? What is your intention? Chapter 527. I'm tired of staying here. I want to go home, White Lotus said. Go home. Lu Chen was momentarily dazed. After a moment of silence, he said, I actually forgot that you have a family. White Lotus rolled her eyes, but she soon said somewhat helplessly, It doesn't matter. I often forget it myself. The two of them looked at each other and laughed. Although they were far from trusting each other, the atmosphere between the two of them eased up a little. Lu Chen didn't seem to have any intention of asking White Lotus's intentions, so he continued walking forward. White Lotus's surname was Bai, and she was born in the Bai clan in Kunwu City, which was at the foot of the Kunlun Mountains. Speaking of which, when Hakushin Jinkuin was still around, White Lotus became his last disciple. However, it was widely rumored that Hakushin Jinkuin was a member of the Bai clan and that he was the Bai clan's biggest backer, which made the Bai clan quite famous for a period of time. However, just like the so-called Tianlan and Tianing, Bai Chen was in fact a Taoist name and not a real name. It was given by Tianlan and Bai Chen's master, Patriarch Tianhong, and not his real name. Therefore, Hakushin Jinkuin had nothing to do with the Bai clan. However, Hakushin Jinkuin's status was too high, so he couldn't be bothered with such rumors. The Bai clan, on the other hand, had an ambiguous attitude. Of course, they didn't dare to spread rumors in public. However, they let it slide from the beginning to the end. They acted like they were wise men and never denied it. They still held the attitude that they would be bastards if they didn't take advantage of the situation. This was no secret in the eyes of those with a bit of status in the Kunlun party. Therefore, Lu Chen never interacted with the Bai clan and didn't have a good impression of them. Back then, when he was suspicious of White Lotus, he asked Old Ma to secretly investigate them, but in the end he didn't find anything. White Lotus wanted to go home. The Bai clan was in Kunwu City, so they naturally had to go to the Westland's Kunlun Mountains. When White Lotus turned to ask Lu Chen where he was going, Lu Chen could only helplessly say, I'm going to the Kunlun Mountains. Since their destination was the same and they knew each other, traveling together seemed to be a matter of course. However, this was only for ordinary people. Lu Chen was not an ordinary person. On the contrary, he had always been different from the others. So, what should have been a scene of the two of them loving each other and walking together didn't happen. Lu Chen said very straightforwardly to White Lotus, The mountain is high and the road is long. Let's part ways here. Goodbye. With that, he turned around and walked away. White Lotus was stunned for a moment, as if she was stunned by this man. After a while, she came back to her senses. She angrily stamped her feet and chased after Lu Chen to stop him. She angrily said, What do you mean? What did I do to provoke you? Why are you running away as soon as you see me? Lu Chen sternly said, I'm afraid that if I fall asleep in the middle of the night, I'll lose my life at some point. As he spoke, he actually turned to look at the black dog beside him and asked, What do you think, Atsu? The large black dog blinked, and then nodded vigorously. He looked as if he wanted to raise his tail to show his approval. You ate those demonic beast meat for nothing. White Lotus scolded angrily and said, This stupid dog is very stupid. How can you trust it and ask it? Atsu was furious. It bared its teeth and let out a threatening growl. It looked a little scary. White Lotus didn't even look at it. She just snorted and said, What are you barking for? If you shout again, I'll let you bleed later. Atsu's neck suddenly shrank as if it was shivering. In fact, Atsu had been reborn after experiencing the southern wilderness and the great snow mountain. It was no longer the same as the weak little mud in the past. However, in the past on Kunlun Mountain, the blood-eating secret method that White Lotus set up was too bloody and terrifying. It probably left a very deep and indelible impression on it. Lu Chen didn't intend to help the black dog that was immersed in its unfortunate memories. Anyway, Atsu would not die even if it was scolded a few times. He just frowned and said, "We'll go our own ways and be at peace with each other. Why do you have to make it so obvious?" White Lotus looked at him and suddenly sneered, "If it's Su Qingjun, I'm afraid it'll be the other way around. You'll be the one pestering her to go with you, and Shiji Su won't be willing to go with you, right?" Lu Chen thought for a while and actually nodded, more or less. After hearing what he said, White Lotus lost her temper for a moment. She rolled her eyes and asked Lu Chen, "Why do I feel like you've been guarding against me and suspecting me?" Lu Chen pointed at himself and said, "Do you think I look stupid?" White Lotus said, "No." Lu Chen said, "All right, then I don't believe you can run out of Immortal City by yourself." White Lotus said, "I'm also very powerful." Lu Chen snorted and said, "No matter how powerful you are, can you be more powerful than the damn Baldy? You're in his hands. As long as he doesn't let go, I don't believe you can run away." White Lotus was discouraged for a moment, then she sneered, "Look at you calling the damn Baldy. It seems like you're very disrespectful to Lord Perfected Immortal." Lu Chen said, "I'll give him a big head. You can go back and say that to him directly." White Lotus was dumbfounded and looked at Lu Chen as if she was looking at a monster. After a while, she said, "What should I say to him? I was almost suffocated by him. Now that I finally have the chance to come out, I have to take a breather before going back." Lu Chen looked at her from the corner of his eyes and said, "Since you're out, you don't plan to run." White Lotus was silent for a while and said, "I won't run. I'm afraid I won't be able to escape and will die even faster." Lu Chen frowned and sighed, but he didn't say anything. In the end, the two of them didn't separate and still walked on the road to Kunlun Mountain together. Although White Lotus didn't say why she came, Lu Chen pretended not to know. This was probably because people were tired of living. Atsu was a little dissatisfied with this and expressed it very clearly. However, the two humans ignored it. This made Atsu very depressed. They could only stroll around all day and refused to go near White Lotus. And White Lotus was also very loyal to her mission and began to ask some questions to Lu Chen from time to time. "How old are you this year? Why are you asking this? What kind of magical power do you practice? Do you think I will tell you this kind of thing? How many people have you killed? I can't remember. How many women have you slept with? Is this something a girl like you should ask? How many? Not one. You're lying, right? Who are you lying to? Well, one last question. If you answer me properly, I won't bother you anymore. I'm already very annoyed. Don't ask any more. Have you ever really fallen in love with a woman?" Lu Chen, who was walking, suddenly stopped. After a while, he walked forward in silence. During that day, he didn't talk to White Lotus again. Chapter 528. In fact, most of the time, Lu Chen and White Lotus were not people who were easy to get along with. White Lotus's temperament had been nurtured since she was a child. When she was a child, she must have suffered a lot from the side of the family. But later on, when she was discovered to have a rare innate talent of 5 pillars, she immediately rose to the sky in a single step and became a treasure loved by everyone. When she was accepted as a disciple by Hakushin Jinkuin of the Kunlun Party, she reached the peak of her life. Everyone was optimistic about her, and everyone thought that this girl would have a bright future in the future. Yuanying Jinren was not a problem, and even the position of deity Jinren could be expected. At that time, on one hand, White Lotus had the full support of the Bai clan, on the other hand, she had the biggest backer in the Kunlun Party, and on the other hand, she had the eldest senior brother, who was the Jinren of the Kunlun Party. Everyone in the Kunlun Party, from top to bottom, treated her like a fairy. In addition, she was born beautiful and moving. At a young age, she already had the temperament of a fairy from the 9th heaven. She was the perfect person in the legends. If those things did not happen later, if there was no person called Jinren Tianlan in this world, presumably, White Lotus would really live a fairy-like life. But now, almost all the dazzling halos on her body had faded. Her master was dead, her senior brother had inexplicably gone into death's seclusion, and there was another senior brother who was even worse, directly defecting to the enemy. Even the Bai clan, who originally regarded her as the future hope of the family's resurgence and had placed unlimited hope on her, suddenly seemed to have become deaf and blind overnight. They completely forgot about her, and almost no longer mentioned her to outsiders. The situation in this world was so cruel, and the gap was so big. It was already very good that White Lotus had not gone crazy and was still struggling to survive. But now, her temper was really like a thorn. Except for bowing her head to the ground in front of the high and mighty Jinren and disregarding her dignity to survive, she was very cold and harsh to others. Even Lu Chen was the same. From time to time, he would mock and make sarcastic remarks. In comparison, Lu Chen seemed to be in a better state. After so many years of suffering, he had long become tactful. Many times, he would smile when he should laugh, and he would lower his head when he should lower his head. But for some reason, he still gave off a cold sense of distance. He was always far away from people, making it hard for people to see his intentions or thoughts. Or perhaps, he let you see his intentions, but then you would wonder if what you saw was his sincerity. Almost everyone was like that when they were with him. No one could get close to his heart. White Lotus was like that, Su Qingjun was like that, Supreme Tianlan was like that, and even Old Ma, who had spent more than 10 years with him, was like that. Perhaps it was because of this that perfected Lord Tianlan could not completely trust him? When these two people walked together, it would of course be strange if they could get along with each other in harmony and intimacy. After traveling together for a few days, Lu Chen and White Lotus, who were both smart people, quickly understood this point. But for some reason, White Lotus forcibly suppressed her temper and often took the initiative to talk to Lu Chen every day, but the atmosphere of the conversation was often very awkward. Lu Chen's reaction to this was very straightforward. He had already been in this situation, and the girl opposite him was not someone who could suppress him or directly decide his fate. So, Lu Chen had no interest in dealing with her, even if White Lotus was indeed a rare beauty in the world. Lu Chen slipped away. In the dead of night, he ran faster than anyone else with the black dog. He was so unpredictable that even White Lotus could not catch up with him. She could only curse angrily in the dark night. After returning to traveling alone, Lu Chen took Atsu and traveled over mountains and rivers. After several years, he finally returned to the western continent and saw the familiar majestic Kunlun mountain range. The vicissitudes and changes of the world didn't seem to change the appearance of the majestic mountains at all. Perhaps in the eyes of the heaven, earth, mountains, and rivers, this bit of time was only a blink of an eye. But for some people, that fleeting glimmer was their whole life. Lu Chen did not hurry to climb the Kunlun mountain. Instead, he entered Kunwa City. Of course, he was also very familiar with Kunwa City. Many things had happened here. In addition to the love and hatred of those years, he had actually wandered in this city even earlier when he was still a child. Later on, he was discovered and taken away by perfected Lord Tianlan, which led to the circumstances of his life later on. In all of Lu Chen's memories, Kunwa City was actually the starting point of everything. He started his life here. Walking on the familiar streets and looking at the familiar scenery, Lu Chen always had the illusion that everything here had never changed. Not only the streets, shops, and houses, but even the people walking here gave him the feeling that nothing had changed since a long time ago. But this feeling was, of course, wrong. Everything had changed. There were many big mansions in Kunwa City, and the rich and powerful families with a long history all lived here. Along the way, Lu Chen was like an ordinary passerby who saw the lintel of the door and recalled the past. The Bai clan style was still very grand, but the people in front of the door seemed to have become calm and low-key. The Atsu family was obviously a bit dilapidated. Could it be that the owner didn't have the heart to take care of it? The servants at the door were all listless. Even their gazes when looking outside seemed to be drifting, as if they had lost their vitality. Later, Lu Chen stopped in front of a slightly smaller house. From a distance, he looked at the words "E Manor" hanging on the lintel of the door. He was silent for a long time before he finally sighed softly. In fact, if he really counted it, it hadn't been a long time since Exian passed away, but in Lu Chen's heart, it seemed like many years had passed. But as time passed, the smile of that young girl became increasingly clear in his heart. Time didn't wear away her beauty, it just quietly occupied a corner in his heart, looking at him with a smile and quietly accompanying him. Compared to Exin, many things that happened on that soul-stirring night had faded from Lu Chen's memory. The struggle for power, the cruel fighting, the fine line between life and death, and all kinds of things that changed the fate of the world. Everything began to become distant to him. Before coming to Kunwa City, he had already asked old Ma about Exian's situation after he left. In the end, Exian's body was taken back by her family. Her father still loved her very much, and it was said that he was extremely sad. After taking care of Exian's funeral, he fell seriously ill. Although he didn't lose his life, his body wasn't as good as it used to be. Even now, the cause of Exian's death was still unclear. In other words, the real murderer still couldn't be determined. How ridiculous this may sound, but it is the truth. Someone once secretly said that it was related to the dead son of the Su family, Sumo, but it was quickly denied by the Su family. Sumo's mother, Madame Bai, denied it with grief and indignation. She would rather die than let her son's name be tarnished after his death. Her attitude was so resolute that no one else in the Su family said anything. The Yi family went to the Kunlun party to investigate, but in the end, the matter was left unresolved. The Su family was a great aristocratic family, and there were some particularly outstanding people in the Kunlun party who had connections with several Yuanying enlightened masters, who told them to be a small family that only knew how to grow tea. Even if they had a Yuanying enlightened master in their sect, this wouldn't be the case. However, the Yi family didn't really make a scene because it wouldn't be beneficial to the entire family. Moreover, in some private occasions, some people who couldn't stand it spoke to them. Exan didn't die unjustly. There were people who were furious for her, people who disregarded everything for her, and people who took revenge for her. Revenge was all that mattered. The dead's wish was fulfilled, the living had to continue living. However, this hatred was buried in the heart and passed on to their descendants. One day, it would grow and sprout. That day, Lu Chen stood outside the Yi family's door, filled with emotions. He reminisced about the past, but of course, he wouldn't think about the future. He just wanted to see Exian again. To be precise, he wanted to see the wooden plaque with Exian's name. For some reason, Lu Chen felt a little lost. He remembered how he felt when he returned to Qingshitang village and stood in front of Ding Dong's grave. They were all beautiful women in the world, but they were gone. He didn't catch them when they were alive, so after the separation of life and death, all that was left were memories. He turned and left the street, but he didn't go far. He found an inn to stay in and waited until the sky turned dark. After settling Atsu in the room, Lu Chen returned to the Yi family's house and climbed over the wall. Chapter 529. The Yi family's house was the kind that had been around for many years but was still very clean and tidy. It was well organized and well arranged. Although it was not as luxurious as the Su family's by family, it had its own elegant atmosphere. At the same time, the layout of the house was very clear. Lu Chen found the ancestral hall at the back of the Yi family's house without much effort. Most families did not have an ancestral hall. Sometimes, only people with the same surname and clan in a village would have a large ancestral hall to worship their ancestors. To be able to set up a special place in the house to build an ancestral hall, it was basically a first-class family or aristocratic family. The Yi family's ancestors had lived a glorious life, so they had left behind a great legacy. There was also an ancestral hall in the house, but it didn't look very big. It was only in a corner of the house. There was a courtyard and a house with green tiles and white walls. When Lu Chen gently entered the secluded courtyard, the surroundings were quiet. Night shrouded the ancestral hall. Only a few altar lamps could be seen inside the door that was always open according to tradition. Under the dim yellow light, the shadows trembled slightly. On the quiet altar table, there were many memorial tablets with the names of the deceased written on them. Lu Chen stared at the house for a moment, then walked over. However, just as he reached the door and was about to step over the threshold, his body suddenly paused. He stopped at the door. Under the altar lamps, his face flickered in the shadows. He frowned slightly and his gaze sharpened. He turned to look at a corner of the ancestral hall. There was a place where the candlelight could not reach, and there was a wooden chair. There was a vague shadow on the chair, and it seemed that a person was sitting there. The night was quiet. There was no sound from inside or outside the house. Lu Chen did not show any fear or guilt. He just stared at the figure. After a while, the shadow moved. Then a person stood up and slowly walked over to stand under the light. He looked like an old man with gray hair and a thin face. At the same time, his face looked as calm as an ancient well without any ripples, as if nothing could disturb him anymore. Lu Chen stared at him for a moment. He suddenly realized that the old man's features were somewhat similar to Exian's. He furrowed his brows and pondered for a moment before cupping his hands in salute and taking a step back to show that he had no enmity. Then he said, "I'm sorry to have disturbed you, Senior." After a pause, he added, "Please don't worry, I'm not a thief." The old man was also looking at him. A stranger had suddenly appeared in his own home, but from start to finish, he did not show any expression of surprise or anger. He only nodded and said, "I know. There is nothing in this ancestral hall. If he was a thief, he would not have come here." Even Lu Chen, who had always been tactful, did not know how to respond. Fortunately, the old man quickly said, "Although our family is a small family, we still have night guards. You must have amazing divine power to be able to sneak in here without alerting anyone. I wonder what your purpose is. Could you please tell me?" Lu Chen was silent for a moment. "I am here to pay my respects to an old friend. I did not want to disturb your family, so I came here in the middle of the night. I am truly ashamed of my inappropriate behavior. I hope Senior can forgive me." The old man seemed surprised and asked, "May I ask which ancestor of the family you wish to pay your respects to?" Lu Chen hesitated for a moment before answering honestly, "Exi." The old man's body trembled slightly and his expression changed slightly. He opened his eyes and stared at Lu Chen for a long time before he suddenly thought of something and said, "Could it be Lu Chen?" Lu Chen was shocked and nodded. "Yes, who are you? How do you know me?" The old man stared at him for a while and sighed. "Please come in." He turned and looked at the memorial tablets on the table. After a moment of silence, he said, "I am Yi Ming, Exian's father." In the silent night, darkness shrouded the land. Most people were asleep except for the ancestral hall in the Yi family's backyard. Two men sat facing each other, talking calmly. "I've asked around about what happened back then. Although our Yi family is no longer what it used to be, we still have a few acquaintances on Kunlun Mountain." Yi Ming said this to Lu Chen. Although he didn't mention any names, Lu Chen understood what he meant. The Yi family was a native of Kunwa City and one of their ancestors was the great Yuanying master. Even though they were weak now, they still had their ways of gathering information. Melaleuca japonica, who took great care of Exian, and Dongfang Tao, who took Exian in as his disciple, were already friends. The ancestral hall wasn't a place to entertain guests, so there naturally wasn't any tea between them. They just sat across from each other. Yi Ming looked at Lu Chen, and after a long moment of silence, he suddenly stood up and solemnly bowed to him. Lu Chen was shocked and hurriedly moved away. "Senior, why?" Yi Ming smiled bitterly. "No matter what, you were the one who avenged Exian back then. The Yi family will always remember this." Lu Chen fell silent. After a while, he said in a low voice, "I'm sorry, I couldn't save her." Yi Ming shook his head and turned to walk to the altar table in the ancestral hall. His eyes swept over the memorial tablets and finally stopped on the memorial tablet at the edge. He sighed softly and said, "Exian, your friend has come to see you." Lu Chen slowly walked over and looked at the wooden tablet. There was only one simple line of words on it, daughter Exion's memorial tablet. At that moment, his lips moved, as if countless memories of the past suddenly surged into his mind. Scene after scene flashed past, and then silently dissipated. He turned his head and looked at Yi Ming with a pleading gaze. Yi Ming sighed, nodded, and moved aside. Lu Chen picked up 3 incense sticks from the altar and lit them on the altar lamp. Green smoke floated into the air, creating a dreamy scene. He stared at the memorial tablet behind Qin Yan, as if he could see the bright, kind, and cheerful young girl from back then. A moment later, he held the incense stick in his hand and respectfully bowed 3 times to Exion's memorial tablet, then inserted it into the incense burner on the altar table. The ancestral hall was silent. Only the green smoke floated in the air. Thinking back to one's life, one would probably become like this green smoke after death. He stood there for a long time before bowing to Yi Ming. "Thank you for your help, Senior. I cannot thank you enough. Since my wish has been fulfilled, I shall take my leave now." Yi Ming nodded. "The Yi family will remember your kindness. If there is anything we can help you with in the future, please don't hesitate to ask." Lu Chen smiled but shook his head. It was not a good thing to be related to him. He cupped his hands at Yi Ming and left the ancestral hall. He leaped into the air and flew into the deep darkness. In the distance, the majestic mountain of Kunlun seemed to be opening its chest in the darkness to welcome the arrival of this stranger. Chapter 530. The night was boundless, and the majestic mountains stood tall. The majestic Kunlun stood tall in the world. No one knew how many years had passed, and how many vicissitudes had it seen. Lu Chen took advantage of the night and swept up the mountain. His figure blended into the darkness, like a shadow that was no different from the surrounding darkness. He passed through quietly and did not alarm any of the patrolling guards. The curfew rule passed down by the Kunlun party for many years was obviously still in effect. In such a famous sect, in the dead of night, except for the disciples who patrolled the mountain, there were almost no other figures. In fact, based on Lu Chen's current status, his position in the Kunlun party could not be underestimated. Just being the only direct disciple of Supreme Tianlan was enough to put him in a position that was second only to one and above tens of thousands of people. After all, in today's Kunlun party, the status of Supreme Tianlan could be said to be supreme, and no one could compare to him. In other words, as long as Supreme Tianlan and Lu Chen were willing, they could announce to the public that Lu Chen had come this time, and the Kunlun party might open the mountain gate to welcome him warmly and hold a welcoming ceremony. However, this time, neither Lu Chen nor Supreme Tianlan had this intention. Instead, they were silent and did not inform the Kunlun party of their actions at all. Taking advantage of the darkness of the night, Lu Chen quietly entered the Kunlun mountain, and Black Dog went with him. They avoided the mysterious patrolling guards of the Kunlun party, went all the way deep, and gradually approached the heart of the Kunlun party. In fact, it was not very easy for ordinary people to sneak into the Kunlun party, but Lu Chen had lived here for many years, and he basically knew the mountains, rivers, and geography of this place. Even Atsu had run wildly in this mountain before. Trekking over mountains and rivers was not a problem for it at all. Instead, it had a sense of familiarity as if it had returned to its hometown. Therefore, it didn't take much effort for the man and the dog to avoid the patrolling guards along the way. From afar, they saw the place known as the Forbidden Area of Kunlun. The once marvelous scenery of the human world, the 4 strange mountains that were floating in midair, now only 3 remained. They drew long shadows in the night sky, and the place that had suddenly become empty seemed a little strange and awkward. When he was in Immortal City, Lu Chen had learned about some of the current situation of the Kunlun party from the well-informed Old Ma. Of course, there were all kinds of complicated situations and undercurrents, but roughly speaking, Hakushin Jinkuin's forces had been completely erased in the past few years. Everything that used to be related to Hakushin Jinkuin had become a taboo, whether openly or secretly, and no one was willing to mention it. Even the winter peak, which had fallen, and the huge piles of soil and rocks that had fallen to the ground were still piled up on Kunlun Mountain, no one seemed to have seen it anymore. Every day, Every time they saw the three peaks of spring, summer, and autumn, people only thought that these three strange peaks had always existed in the world, and there had never been a fourth peak. That was probably how shallow human relationships were. Or maybe there were some people who still remembered in their hearts that they were not unkind, but the affairs of the world had come to this. In the end, they could not be like a mantis trying to stop a chariot, and they could only go with the wind and dust. As the disciple of Supreme Tianlun, Lu Chen, of course, would not have such worries in his heart. After glancing at the empty night sky expressionlessly, his expression did not change at all, and he continued to move forward. Soon he and Atsu approached the forbidden area of Kunlun, the place that was shrouded in thick fog all year round. A small mountain that was made up of huge rocks and countless piles of soil was at the edge of the thick fog. Half of it was exposed outside the thick fog, and the other half was covered by the thick fog. In the darkness of the night, this tall mountain stood quietly. One could vaguely see that the mountain was no longer desolate, and a lot of weeds and greenery had grown on it. Life was like this. Even though the winter peak was cold and nothing could grow on it, in the years after the crash, the land that had turned into an ownerless mountain would naturally be covered with greenery after being watered by the wind and rain. Lu Chen glanced at the mountain, but he could no longer see any trace of the majestic and austere mountain from back then. Everything had completely collapsed that night, including the once insufferably arrogant glory, fame, wealth, and majesty. All that was left was the soil that had fallen into the dust in front of him. He expressionlessly turned his head, walked around the mountain, and continued to walk towards the thick fog. However, when he saw that the thick fog was getting closer and closer, Lu Chen suddenly stopped. After thinking for a moment, he turned his head to look at Atsu and said, "You better not go in with me." Atsu looked a little stunned. It tilted its head and looked into the depths of the thick fog, as if it was a little unwilling. However, Lu Chen shook his head and walked over to touch Atsu's head. He whispered, "There are some things inside. No, you don't want to see them. Just wait for me outside." Although Atsu was unwilling, it was very obedient to Lu Chen most of the time. It immediately nodded, wagged its tail, and licked his hand. Lu Chen smiled and hugged it gently. Then, he turned around and took a deep breath before striding into the thick fog. The fog engulfed Lu Chen's figure in the blink of an eye. At this time, it was more and more obvious that this place was strange. The land was so close, but there seemed to be an invisible boundary or a transparent high wall in the void. The fog was always gathered on the side of the boundary, and no matter what, it would not cross the boundary. The gray and tall fog wall blocked all the prying eyes. Even Atsu couldn't see the situation in the fog. After Lu Chen went inside, it was as if he suddenly disappeared from this world. There was no sound or movement. Atsu waited in the same place for a long time, and gradually began to feel a little bored. It turned its head and looked around. Then, its gaze fell on the earthen mountain not far away. In the night, the mountain formed by the collapsed winter peak looked like it was cut in half by the fog. The exposed half of the mountain looked very ugly and steep. Suddenly, Atsu seemed to be startled. It raised its head and looked up. At the top of the mountain far away, in the darkness where the thick fog intersected, there was suddenly a glimmer of light. It was like a shadow, swaying in the dark night. Atsu stared at the dark high place. After a while, it took the first step forward and began to slowly climb up the mountain. The mountain was steep, and the terrain was dangerous. Although many places were covered with grass and trees, there were still some dangerous places. It was easy for sand and stones to roll down, and if one was not careful, one would fall from the high place. However, Atsu was obviously very good at this. It walked all the way, jumping and running, and gradually approached the top of the mountain. Then, in the thick fog not far in front of it, Atsu's body suddenly trembled. In the thick fog, it suddenly saw a pair of huge eyes in front of it. Even the darkness could not block the light in the eyes, staring at it coldly. Above and below the mountain, in the shadow of the night, it was silent. Chapter 5:31. The cold wind blew, and the thick fog rolled and drifted, but it always stayed on the other side of the invisible boundary line, which looked very strange. In particular, the pair of eyes that had suddenly appeared in the mist on top of this mountain made one's scalp tingle. They were dark and mysterious. Atsu took a step back, but it did not have the intention to turn around and run away. Instead, it stared at the pair of eyes, which seemed to be very bold and fearless. After a while, Atsu let out a few deep roars, but it wasn't the kind that was threatening or threatening. Instead, it seemed to have a hint of inquiry and verification. The thick fog floated slowly, and after a while, a strange sound suddenly came from the fog. Moo! Atsu's eyes immediately lit up. There was actually some excitement on his face as he took a few steps forward. Not long after, the thick fog shook, and then a huge body slowly appeared from the fog. It was a huge oxen. On Mount Kunlun, the territory of the Kunlun party, such a huge oxen could enter and exit the forbidden area of Kunlun and scrupulously without any harm. Needless to say, it could only be the special oxen of Supreme Tianlun. Atsu grinned. It had not seen this oxen for many years, but it did not seem to be too unfamiliar with this oxen. It ran up quickly and circled around this oxen a few times, barking, and excitedly stretched out its front paw to pat oxen's belly a few times. Of course, oxen should also recognize this big black dog. Although when Atsu was still in Mount Kunlun, it was still a weak native dog, but oxen was still oxen. It had helped Atsu once, so it naturally had good taste. At this moment, facing the very happy Atsu, oxen looked more like a somewhat gratified but still calm big boss. It did not show much excessive excitement, but oxen did not dislike Atsu's excited behavior. At most, it looked at it helplessly with a little tolerance. Moo! Oxen let out a cry and walked out of the fog completely. Then, like before, it found a flat place on the earthen hill and lay down on its stomach, as if it had become a part of the earthen hill. Atsu followed, still looking very excited. It chased after oxen and kept barking, until oxen's tail suddenly stood up and patted its head a few times. Atsu shrunk its head, and only then did it calm down. In fact, after a few years, Atsu's appearance had also changed greatly. In terms of body shape, the mutated black dog was not much different from oxen. However, this oxen's aura was too strong. Wherever it went, it had the appearance of a king. Any creature in front of it would feel like they were a head shorter than it, which was why Atsu was still a little short. Oxen lay on the top of the earthen hill and looked into the distance. In the depths of the night, Kunlun mountain range was undulating, and everything was quiet and normal as usual. However, now that there was a black dog by his side, and thinking about its origin, it was definitely not normal. Moo! This time, Oxen was looking at the black dog, and there was a trace of doubt in its voice. Atsu hesitated for a moment, and then it probably thought of the identity and background of this giant beast in front of it, so it decisively betrayed Lu Chen. It stretched out one of its front legs and pointed in a certain direction at the foot of the mountain. Oxen rolled its eyes, but it had no intention of interfering. It still lay on the ground and did not move. This made Atsu, who originally wanted to follow this big boss beast into the thick fog to have a look, a little disappointed. It could not help but let out a few soft barks. Oxen did not pay attention to it, and seemed to have something on its mind. At that moment, it seemed to inadvertently look up into the sky. In the depths of the thick fog, there seemed to be a huge shadow swaying in the rolling fog, but it quickly disappeared into the depths of the fog. At this moment, suddenly, Oxen's eyes focused, and it turned its head to look at the bottom of the earthen hill. At the same time, Atsu seemed to have felt something, and at the same time, it walked to Oxen's side and looked down. In the silent night, a figure suddenly walked over from afar. Her clothes fluttered in the night wind, and her face was beautiful, like a fairy who had descended from the moon. It was White Lotus. In the night, Oxen and Black Dog did not make a sound, nor did they do anything else. They just quietly watched the girl come closer. White Lotus seemed to be very cautious, and her brows were slightly furrowed. She was also very wary of her surroundings, and from time to time, she would look around. However, perhaps it was because of the angle of her line of sight, she did not seem to notice the two animals on the earthen hill. Just like that, she slowly walked around the foot of the earthen hill, and then stood in front of the thick fog. She stared at the wall of thick fog, and a complicated expression appeared on her face, and she began to daydream. Should I go in or not? On the earthen hill, Oxen turned its head to look at Black Dog, and Atsu immediately shook its head, indicating that it did not know this person at all. It was the kind of person that had no relationship with him, and was very certain of it. Then Atsu's eyes turned, and it moved closer to Oxen's huge horn with its head, as if it was trying to encourage the mysterious and unpredictable Ox King of Kunlun to teach the arrogant girl a lesson for trespassing into the forbidden area. Oxen looked at it, and after a moment of hesitation, it slowly stood up. Atsu was instantly happy, and it wagged its tail and grinned silently. Of course, it was Lu Chen's first time coming to this forbidden area of Kunlun. Even though he had lived in the Kunlun party for many years, and had a secret special relationship with Lord Tianlon, he had always stayed away from places that would easily attract attention, and that was also the instinct of a shadow. However, now that he had a special mission from Lord Tianlon, the situation was naturally different. Although he had never entered this mysterious place shrouded in thick fog, since Lord Tianlon had sent him here, he would naturally have some instructions. Therefore, Lu Chen already had a good idea of the situation of this forbidden area between the clouds and the sky. For example, he now knew that the destination of his trip was not just in this thick fog. What was hidden in the thick fog was just a secret entrance. The biggest secret of the Kunlun sect, a 1,000-year-old sect, was actually hidden in the mysterious underground palace deep under the ground. To be honest, when he first heard this secret from Lord Tianlon, Lu Chen's heart reacted almost instantly, and he thought of the mysterious underground palace under the immortal city. Although the two were very different, he did not know why, but he suddenly linked the two places together. Was it finally time for the secrets hidden under the dust of time to reveal their true faces one by one? Lu Chen walked slowly, and the surrounding fog automatically moved away from him. It was as if there was some strange thing or strange power on his body that could disperse the fog, as well as the strange things in the fog that couldn't be explained clearly. Then he walked all the way to the center of the thick fog and saw that place. Chapter 5:32. Lu Chen took out something from his bosom. It was a golden seal the size of half a palm. The golden seal was golden in color and radiated in all directions. The radiance that it emitted carried a sense of solemnity and solemnity. There was actually a faint aura of a king. When Lu Chen took out the golden seal and placed it on his palm, it was as if it had broken free from its shackles. The golden radiance immediately shot out in all directions. The radiance was so dazzling that it even made Lu Chen's face look like it was smeared with a layer of faint gold leaf. He had transformed into the golden statue of a deity in the temple. The dense fog that was originally entrenched and rolling in the surroundings suddenly retreated. Wherever the golden radiance passed, the fog that could not disperse in time was directly fixed by the radiance. Then, it forcibly evaporated and disappeared. In that short period of time, one could still vaguely hear some low, frightened, mournful screams bursting out from the depths of the thick fog. They were filled with despair and fear. Wherever the golden radiance passed, there seemed to be no dark corners that could be hidden. Lu Chen stared at the golden seal in his palm. There was a trace of a complicated expression on his face. He gently rubbed it. From his fingertips, he felt that it was hard to the touch. On top of the golden seal was carved a lifelike golden dragon. It bared its fangs and brandished its claws. It had a powerful and imposing aura. Its glaring eyes seemed to have a power that looked down on the world. When he gently turned the golden seal over, he saw that under the square seal base, there was only one word engraved: heaven. This golden seal was, of course, a treasure. Moreover, it was a unique treasure in the heavenly realm. However, the people in the world who knew of its existence were as rare as phoenix feathers and unicorn horns. To be exact, for thousands of years, there had never been more than 2 people who knew of this golden seal. Many years ago, this golden seal was called the Tianshou seal. It was said that the original meaning was to live as long as the heavens. Later on, someone gave it another name. It was called the Kunlun seal. Legend has it that this golden seal was forged from the essence of the majestic Kunlun mountain range by the gods of ancient times. It was the essence of the mountains, the crystallization of the earth. Then this treasure suddenly disappeared from history, never to be seen again. Or perhaps it had appeared before, but other than the owner of the treasure, everyone else who saw it was dead. Yes, since ancient times, this Kunlun seal had always been silently passed down among the inheritors of the heavenly Taoist name, and it had never been shown to the outside world, even to those of the same sect who were as close as brothers. From Tianhong to Tianlan, and from Tianlan to Diani. These words were said by perfected Lord Tianlan to Lu Qin. That day, when he handed the Kunlun seal to Lu Qin, perfected Lord Tianlan's expression seemed so relaxed, as if a heavy burden had been lifted from his shoulders. He looked at Lu Qin with a smile and an expression that seemed to be filled with an indescribable trust. What else could prove perfected Lord Tianlan's sincerity better than this? With the Kunlun seal and the knowledge of the ancient secrets, one could freely enter and exit the forbidden area of Kunlun. One could also know and master the biggest secret in the history of the Kunlun party. If this wasn't trust, then what was trust? If this wasn't regarding him as an inheritor and wanting to entrust everything to him, then what was? Lu Qin clenched the golden seal in his hand. He looked at the scene in front of him, which was almost exactly the same as what perfected Lord Tianlan had said. There was no change at all. He frowned, and for the first time, a hint of doubt slowly appeared on his face. Could it be that the damn Baldy, was he really sincere to him? Was everything he said true? Could it be that all this time, his unshakable wariness towards this person was actually all wrong? Lu Qin silently stared at the ground in front of him. Countless scenes of the past flashed through his mind, but he temporarily put them to the back of his mind. The golden seal's light flowed and flickered. An invisible force spread out. Then, without a sound, a bottomless hole that led to the dark and deep underground appeared in that mysterious land. He still had something to do. The biggest secret hidden in the Kunlun Mountains was the purpose of his trip. He clenched the Kunlun seal in his hand, took a deep breath, and then jumped down. The hole was very deep and very dark. He couldn't even see his fingers in front of him. However, the golden light of the Kunlun seal could illuminate the surroundings. Therefore, Lu Qin saw that even in this deep underground cave, there was still a dense fog. Behind the fog, there seemed to be more mysterious and strange things, bigger and scarier. Those things seemed to be sentient. They sensed that someone had suddenly intruded into this mysterious place. Therefore, they were all angry, or rather, they were all ecstatic and excited. Countless thick fog surged wildly and swarmed toward Lu Qin from all directions. It was as if the omnipresent darkness was laughing and roaring, wanting to devour everything. Until the golden light stopped in front of the fog. The golden light was like the solemnity of an emperor, blocking all the darkness 3 feet away. Wherever the light reached, the darkness turned into ashes. The things in the darkness roared furiously, but no matter what, they didn't dare to get close to the golden light. Lu Qin looked at the terrible scene around him expressionlessly. As he fell faster and faster, the surrounding dark fog began to appear with lightning-like silver lights. They tore through the darkness and wandered in every corner of the fog like ghosts. Sometimes they disappeared, sometimes they burst out, as if they had moved all the thunder in the sky into this abyss. When Lu Qin fell, all of a sudden, all the electric lights soared into the air, and suddenly there was a shrill and creepy sound in the air. At that moment, the golden light was suddenly compressed, and suddenly rolled back to less than a foot away from Lu Qin. The wind whistled, and the thick fog pressed forward. When it was so close, it was as if there was only darkness in front of him, as if there was a devil opening its terrifying mouth in front of him. Behind him, above him, and in all directions, he was surrounded by the evil spirits in the fog. The next moment he would be torn apart. Lu Qin closed his eyes and no longer looked at the terrible scene around him. He just tightened his grip on the Kunlun seal in his hand. The dazzling golden light once again became bright. Although it was slow but steady, it slowly expanded in all directions. Countless low growls, with disappointment and resentment, came from the darkness, and then slowly went away. The electric lights disappeared, the terrifying power that could make people crazy dissipated. The darkness became silent again, and then Lu Chen's falling speed also suddenly began to slow down. Breathing deeply, Lu Chen once again opened his eyes. Those terrible scenes seemed to be left in the darkness above his head, and no longer appeared in front of his eyes. Only he himself knew that his back was already drenched in sweat. In those dangerous moments before, if he slightly relaxed and lost his mind, what awaited him would probably be a fate that was more painful than death. His speed gradually slowed down, and the surroundings also gradually became spacious. After an unknown period of time, the Kunlun seal brought Lu Chen and slowly landed on a piece of land. Just what kind of secret was hidden in the depths of this unknown depth? Lu Chen let out a long breath, but without any hesitation he held the Kunlun seal in his palm and continued to walk forward. In the distant depths of the darkness, there was a vague shadow of a huge door, faintly discernible in the darkness. Chapter 5:33. The figure of the girl at the foot of the hill had been standing in front of the thick fog. She did not turn around to leave, nor did she walk into the fog. On top of the hill, Oxen and Black Dog were lying side by side, looking down with a strange look in their eyes. After a while, White Lotus suddenly moved. She lifted one of her feet and seemed to want to walk forward. On top of the hill, Oxen and Black Dog immediately raised their heads and looked at White Lotus in surprise. Atsu even stood up. White Lotus leaned forward and was about to walk forward, but her foot suddenly stopped in midair. Then, no one knew what she was thinking, but she silently retracted her foot. She stood in the same place and began to stare blankly, not moving for a long time. This confused the two animals on the hill. Atsu turned its head and looked at Oxen. Oxen also had a puzzled look in its eyes. It probably did not understand what the girl at the foot of the hill was trying to do. Atsu could not hold it in any longer. He approached the green ox and muttered a few words to it in a low voice. The green ox glared at him and shook its huge head. However, it lay down again as if it did not intend to do anything. Atsu looked in the direction of the thick fog and seemed to be a little anxious. It then looked down at the foot of the hill. Unexpectedly, White Lotus, who was standing in front of the thick fog and seemed to be hesitating whether to go in or not, suddenly took a few steps back without saying a word. It seemed like she had given up on going in. However, White Lotus's eyes were still on the thick fog in front of her. Occasionally, she would look up at the remaining 3 strange peaks that were still floating high in the sky. The light in her eyes was dim and difficult to see. Atsu looked back and forth and finally, it seemed like it could not stand it anymore. It was either curious or worried about Lu Chen, who had walked into the thick fog and disappeared. It turned around and looked at the fog for a while, then slowly and tentatively walked over. The place it walked to was the corner of the hill that Oxen had walked out of from the thick fog. It looked no different from its surroundings, at least from outside the thick fog. Behind it, the green ox seemed to have sensed something as well. It silently turned its head and glanced at Atsu's back. Standing in front of the thick fog, Atsu only felt that everything in front of it was gray, vague, and unfathomable. There seemed to be a kind of faintly frightening atmosphere in front of it. However, the fact that Lu Chen had walked in and Oxen had also walked out of it probably gave Atsu a lot of courage. Therefore, Atsu did not hesitate for too long. It tentatively raised its foot and stretched out its foot into the thick fog. The front of the dog's paw touched the fog. Just like all the fog in the world, Atsu's foot entered it without feeling anything. The thick fog in front of it was not like the terrible poisonous miasma in the legends, where anything that touched it would immediately be poisoned and turn into a pool of yellow water. Everything seemed to be normal. Except for the fact that the fog was a little thicker, it seemed to be harmless to Atsu. After a few attempts, Atsu suddenly became bold. It turned around and barked at Oxen, then walked forward. However, it did not notice that behind it, Oxen was looking at it as if it was looking at a fool. Atsu was very happy and proud. After its body entered the thick fog, it found that nothing had happened. Everything was safe. Then it wagged its tail and turned around. It proudly poked its head out of the fog and barked at Oxen. It seemed to be saying hello, but it also seemed to be saying something like, "Look at me." Oxen looked at it quietly with a strange look in its eyes. Atsu grinned. Just as it was about to show off a few more times, its face suddenly froze. It seemed to have felt something. A moment later, a trace of panic suddenly flashed across its eyes. However, before it could react, it saw the thick fog around it suddenly rolled rapidly from all directions and suddenly surrounded it. Atsu whined, and then its whole body seemed to be suddenly lifted into the air. Then, with a swoosh, the dog's head, which was the only thing left outside the fog, was suddenly dragged into the thick fog. Only a faint hole was left, and then it was immediately filled by the surrounding fog. In the depths of the thick fog far away, the angry and panicked barks of the black dog could be vaguely heard. Oxen rolled its eyes and seemed to sigh helplessly. Then it stood up and slowly walked into the thick fog, step by step, into the depths of the fog. About 10 feet away from the thick fog, White Lotus, who was hesitating and pacing back and forth, suddenly raised her head and looked in front of her with a somewhat surprised expression. At that moment, when she was hesitating and struggling in her heart, she suddenly seemed to hear a strange sound coming from the depths of the thick fog in front of her. It seemed to be a scream, a little panicked and a little shrill. Perhaps it was because of this that White Lotus actually could not tell what it was. Was it a human, a beast, or one of those mysterious spirits and ghosts in the legends? This thick fog sealed off the forbidden area of the Kunlun party. For many years, the Kunlun party had forbidden ordinary disciples to come here. In other words, great cultivators who were above the level of Zhenren Yuaning would have some opportunities to go to the 4 strange peaks above the clouds in the sky to cultivate. However, this place on the ground seemed to have always been a place that only the few people with the highest status could enter. In other words, in the past 100 years, it seemed that the only people who could set foot in the forbidden area of Kunlun were Lord Tianlan and her deceased master Hakushin Jinkuan. Until today, there was a third person, Lu Chen. Carrying the strange order secretly given by Lord Tianlan, White Lotus of course knew that the final destination of Lu Chen's journey to the west was the forbidden area of Kunlun. Therefore, although she was cunningly thrown off by Lu Chen halfway, she was very angry but not flustered. She directly returned to the Kunlun party and sneaked into the vicinity of the forbidden area of Kunlun Mountain. After waiting patiently for a period of time, as expected, Lu Chen also came here with Black Dog. However, along the way, the matter of probing Lu Chen that was originally given to her by Lord Tianlan had completely failed. If it failed, then so be it. Anyway, when the time came, she just had to find a way to evade it. Otherwise, there was no better way. However, the forbidden area of Kunlun in front of her made White Lotus feel a little conflicted. Many years ago, when she was still a disciple of Hakushin Jinkuan, she lived on the winter peak of the 4 strange peaks. At that time, she looked down from the sky. Of course, she could see the thick fog on a sunny day. She used to be curious about what was in the forbidden area. However, now that time had passed, even the winter peak had been destroyed in the mountain. Naturally, the feelings of the past were no longer there. Even if it was her, she was just a pitiful person who lived under someone else's roof and had to rely on someone else. But what secret was hidden in this thick fog? Judging from the solemnity of the Kunlun party, there must be a big secret in it. Then, could this secret be an opportunity that she longed for? No matter who it was, falling from the high clouds to the dust all of a sudden, from a proud daughter of heaven to a puppet whose life and death were in the hands of someone else, everyone would feel indignant and want to break free. No matter how big the price was, they would be willing to pay. White Lotus's expression kept changing. Then she could not help but slowly approach the thick fog. In the next moment she suddenly gritted her teeth, and then she strode forward and walked into the mist as well. She was walking towards her unknown fate. Chapter 5:34. In the dead of night, the Kunlun Mountains, shrouded in darkness, looked like a giant who had fallen asleep. The Kunlun party's curfew had been passed down for many years, and it hadn't changed to this day. In the pitch-black night, Most places were shrouded in darkness. Except for the Kunlun Party's sect leader, a certain corner of the Xinjiang Hall where the sect leader of the Kunlun Party resided. The current Kunlun Party's acting sect leader, the Thousand Lantern sect leader, was still awake. He was sitting in front of a desk with a lit candle on it. The candle was covered with a delicately crafted lampshade, allowing the dim candlelight to illuminate the area around him. It also illuminated his solemn and indifferent expression. The Kunlun Party had been established for thousands of years. Naturally, it had already seen countless worldly affairs in the world. Occasionally, an accident happened to the sect leader, and the sect would nominate a temporary sect leader to take over the position. But of the people sitting in this position, he was probably the only one who hadn't removed the word acting from his title for so long. Under the candlelight, there was nothing on the smooth and flat table. There was only a letter placed in front of the Thousand Lantern sect leader. The Thousand Lantern sect leader's gaze fell on the letter. There were a few lines of words on it, heavy and powerful, with an extraordinary bearing. The meaning between the lines was also very simple. In the next few days, the strength of the patrolling guards on Kunlun Mountains should be relaxed. There wasn't even a signature at the end of the letter, and the words between the lines were all direct narration without any honorifics. Although he didn't scold or hurl insults, his words were straightforward, and there was a faint condescending and superior tone that seemed to be on the verge of bursting out. The Thousand Lantern sect leader looked at the letter expressionlessly. He read the words on the letter word by word. He didn't know how many times he had read it, but his face was gloomy. Suddenly he stood up, turned around, and walked towards the door. In the middle of this, his wide sleeve brushed across the table. When it slid down the table, the letter on the table had already disappeared. Pushing the door open, the Thousand Lantern sect leader walked into the darkness. In the deep night, there was only darkness around him. There wasn't a shadow of a person. Even he himself looked like a ghostly shadow walking in the night, moving forward alone. The cold night wind blew past. He passed through the corridors and walked along the stone path, walking further and further into the night. He did not meet anyone along the way, because he had secretly arranged for the night patrol guards to be sent away. People's moods change, don't they? Thinking back to when he first ascended to the throne, he was full of ambition and looked down on everyone. He felt that his achievements were so brilliant that his 100 years of forbearance were not in vain. Once he grasped great power in one day, he would be filled with great ambition and ambition. He would definitely make a peerless achievement, make the people of the world look at him, make tens of thousands of people respect him, and make the majestic Kunlun's successive generations of founding masters sigh with admiration and pride. Only in this way could he live his life in vain. Only in this way would he be worthy of his abilities, and he wouldn't have wasted so many years of suffering. A cold night breeze blew over, brushing past his cheeks. The chill was like a knife. Qian Dangzhenren's footsteps slowed down. He looked at the sky, the corner of his eyes slightly twitching, but there was grief and indignation in his eyes. But who would have thought that things would turn out like this? His ambition was empty, and he carried the title of sect leader spiritual master in vain. But how many disciples and how many forces in the sect could not work together until today? Each one of them secretly colluded, each one of them paid lip service, and each one of them opposed in secret. Even the two words acting sect leader spiritual master, in front of his head, in a flash of many years, unexpectedly no one proposed to remove it. Why was this? That year when he first ascended to the throne, he sat upright on the high platform, majestic and solemn. Every day when he walked through the sect, the disciples who saw him would respectfully salute him, calling him sect leader spiritual master. How comfortable and happy was that? Even if he carried a solemn expression on his face, his heart was truly happy. But now? So many years had passed, but the two words acting still existed in his title, and his mood had also changed drastically. The disciples who met him in the past were still respectful when they saw him, and even the way they addressed him didn't change. But in his heart, there was no longer the slightest bit of happiness. Qian Dangzhenren couldn't help but secretly think in his heart, these people, these seemingly respectful disciples, Every time they saw him and addressed him respectfully, were they laughing in their hearts? Were they secretly ridiculing him, the acting sect leader spiritual master who had held the position for the longest time in history? Every day, Qian Dengzhenren felt that his days were beginning to become torment, because he constantly discovered that everyone under the heavens didn't respect him very much. In everyone's hearts, the Kunlun party still had a real emperor, and that was the true existence that everyone revered. That person was like a sun, burning fiercely, radiating boundless light, suppressing all other radiance, so that everyone could only see him. Even the sect leader spiritual master, who was supposed to be the highest leader of the Kunlun party, was overshadowed in front of him. This matter shouldn't have been like this. Qian Dengzhenren stopped in his tracks. In this boundless night, he passed through the curtain of night and finally arrived at the foot of a dark mountain. There was a tightly shut cave abode there, and the entrance was overgrown with weeds, as if it had long been abandoned. Qian Dengzhenren quietly stood at the entrance of the cave abode, a trace of hesitation and doubt in his eyes. But when he clenched his hands in his wide sleeves, he touched another light object. It was like a letter that was as light as a feather. But for Qian Dengzhenren, that letter was perhaps as heavy as Mount Tai. He took a deep breath, threw all his worries to the back of his mind, and quietly walked over. The abandoned cave abode's stone door was tightly shut, but traces of the restrictions could still be faintly seen. But for Qian Dengzhenren, who had grasped many of Kunlun's secrets, this was no problem at all. He easily unlocked the restrictions, and as the heavy stone door opened, he walked in. Darkness extended ahead, but the air was unexpectedly not oppressive and oppressive. It should be because this place had maintained good ventilation for many years. After walking through the dark passage, there seemed to be a somewhat oppressive light coming from the depths of the cave abode. At the same time, in the depths of the dark shadows, behind the light, there seemed to be a voice that lightly coughed and let out a sigh. Qian Dengzhenren looked in that direction, and without further hesitation he directly walked over. The darkness clustered around his figure as he walked into the depths of the cave, and he saw the source of the light. It was a bright pearl embedded in the rock stratum above his head, emitting a faint glimmer. Behind the light was a stone bed, and a figure was sitting on it without moving at all, as if he was a wooden statue. A few chains that were suspended in the shadows were deeply nailed into the incomparably hard stone wall. At the same time, with the help of the faint light, one could see the strange runes on the chains. The light was flickering, and a strong aura of magic power was constantly emitting from them. The figure in the shadows slowly raised his head and glanced at Qian Dengzhenren. Qian Dengzhenren's expression was complicated as he stared at the darkness. After a moment, he sighed and said, "Long time no see, senior brother." Chapter 5:35. The face of the person in the shadows was a bit indistinct. His long hair draped over his shoulders, but he didn't appear unkempt. His clothes could also be considered neat and tidy, as if he had lived in seclusion for a long time. He raised his head and looked at Thousand Lantern, who had just walked in. His eyes faintly flickered in the darkness outside of the luminous pearl's light. After a while, the person's body moved as if he wanted to get up, but a strange sound suddenly came from his surroundings. The iron chains hidden in the shadows trembled, and several of the strange runes that were filled with the aura of spiritual power lit up. As a result, he quickly sat back down and let out a muffled groan as if he was in pain. But he quickly regained his composure and nodded to Thousand Lantern. "Long time no see, junior brother Thousand Lantern. It's inconvenient for me to move around here and I can't get up to greet you. You can do as you please." Thousand Lantern Taoist was speechless. He looked around and saw that there wasn't even a stone bench in the stone room. Even if there was a stone bench, it probably wouldn't be of any use. After a moment of silence, he walked over to the side of the stone bed where the figure was. He didn't care about the dust that fell from the bed and just sat down on the edge of the stone bed. At this moment, the distance between Thousand Lantern Taoist and that figure was only about an arm's length. That person had been sitting in the shadows and looking at Thousand Lantern Taoist. He seemed to be very calm and didn't show any signs of anger. Instead, he looked at Thousand Lantern Taoist's expression and suddenly smiled. Then he said, "What's wrong? You look like you've encountered something difficult." Taoist Qian Deng's hands were hidden in his sleeves. Because of the position he was sitting in, half of his face was exposed to the light of the luminous pearl, while the other half was hidden in the shadows. At first glance, he seemed to be divided into two halves by the light and the darkness. Black and white were distinct, but his expression was uncertain. After hearing the question from the person in the shadows, Thousand Lantern was silent for a moment before replying, "I didn't think that sitting in this position would be so difficult." The man stared blankly for a moment. He probably didn't expect Thousand Lantern Taoist to say such a thing to him. After a while, he smiled bitterly and shook his head without saying anything. Taoist Master Qian Deng asked again, "Shi Xiang, when you were the sect leader, did you have the same feeling as me?" "That's right." In the entire Kunlun party, the only person whom Taoist Master Qian Deng would address as senior brother was the former sect leader Taoist Master, who was now forced to go into seclusion due to severe injuries. In the past, his name had shaken the world, but today he was a prisoner, unable to see the light of day, and dying without a sound. If it was anyone else, perhaps such a fortuitous encounter would drive them insane. However, Perfected Idol Month seemed to be able to remain calm. From the beginning to the end, his expression and words did not change much. After hearing Taoist Master Qian Deng's words, he pondered for a moment before replying in a soft voice, "You have martial uncle Tianlan above you now, but when I was in your position, there were two great gods, my master and martial uncle Tianlan above me." Taoist Master Qian Deng was silent. After a while, he turned his head to look at Perfected Idol Month. In the darkness, Perfected Idol Month also looked at him. Their gazes met and a moment later, they both smiled bitterly. Looking at such a situation, probably no one would have thought that on a certain full moon night a few years ago, the two of them would be archenemies who couldn't coexist like fire and water. "You didn't come here today just to vent your grievances to me, did you? Is there anything else?" Perfected Idol Month asked. Taoist Master Qian Deng frowned and pondered. His eyes swept over the inconspicuous but frightening dark chains around Perfected Idol Month. After a while, he said softly, "When I rose up, I wanted to get rid of you, and I also wanted to sit in the position of sect master. The expectations of generations of masters of Baichao Tang are all on me, and I must do it." Perfected Idol Month nodded and said, "I understand." The corner of Taoist Master Qian Deng's eyes seemed to twitch slightly, and then he said, "But I thought about killing you, but I didn't think he would imprison and torture you like this. I really don't understand why he didn't just kill you directly." Taoist Master Idol Moon also became silent. Perhaps it was because the mentioned by Taoist Master Qian Deng was too powerful and carried a boundless and terrifying pressure. Even though he wasn't here, the two of them still felt suffocated and oppressed. He just sighed and said with a wry smile, "Martial Uncle's heart is as deep as the sea. Who knows what he is thinking?" Taoist Master Qian Deng was silent for a while, and then he said, "I once asked Martial Uncle Tianlan about this. He told me that since ancient times, there have been many internal conflicts in the Kunlun party, but there has never been a case of killing a sect master." Perfected Idol Month was stunned, and then he shook his head with a wry smile. After he finished speaking, Taoist Master Qian Deng's expression was similar to Perfected Idol Month's. Of course, such words had no credibility. Since ancient times, the Kunlun party had never killed a perfected cultivator of Huashan realm in an internal conflict. Then what about Hakushin Jinkun? Perfected Idol Month closed his eyes, looking quiet and serene. Even though he was not free at the moment, he still looked a little like the solemn and dignified old days. After a while, he lowered his voice and said, "Junior brother Qian Deng, if you have anything to ask me, just ask. I'm already like this, so why can't I say it?" Taoist Master Qian Deng frowned and looked at Perfected Idol Month with some hesitation. But after a while, he seemed to think of all the shackles of time in the past few years, and finally he slowly leaned toward Perfected Idol Month. "Senior brother, you've been the sect master for many years. How much do you know about the forbidden area under the clouds in the sky behind the mountain? the soft and low voice began to echo in this unknown and dark cave. It was always easy to get lost in the dark. Sometimes, they would lose their direction. Sometimes, they would lose their sense of time. Sometimes, they would even lose themselves. They would feel that everything in the past was wrong. However, when they wanted to choose a new path, they would either find that it was too late, or they would see only darkness in front of them. There was no light at all. When Lu Chen walked in the darkness, in the silence, his mind inexplicably recalled the first half of his life. Like a shadow, he often lived in the dark and walked behind the light until one day, he personally shattered the darkness. He had never regretted it, and he could not regret it. Because when he stabbed Yun Shouyang's back with his saber, he was destined to have no way out. He was a shadow, but he was destined to belong to the light. He raised his head and stopped walking. The huge door appeared in front of him. The golden light of the Kunlun seal sprinkled on the ancient door, as if it was narrating the dust-laden history of the past. He silently looked at it and then walked forward. For some reason, the darkness here was especially thick, and even the golden light could not force back the shadow. Therefore, when looking from the back, one could clearly see that Lu Chen was walking out of the darkness with the golden seal, and step by step, he walked into the depths of the darkness until the darkness completely swallowed his figure and then disappeared without a trace. Boom! In the depths of the distant darkness, there seemed to be a low and deep sound, as if a heavy door had opened a small gap and then slowly closed. Chapter 5:36. Lu Chen had already discovered that the darkness he was in was different from the darkness he had been in before. The darkness here was particularly thick. Although people did not feel any discomfort in it, the oppressive feeling was unusually obvious. If all the darkness of the night in the human world was like a thin veil of mist, once a light shone, it would retreat calmly and quietly. But at this moment, inside and outside this ancient and huge door, the darkness here was so thick that even the light seemed to be swallowed. There was light in the darkness. It came from the Kunlun seal in Lu Chen's hand. The golden light was still flickering, but it was different from when he was walking in the thick fog on the ground. At that time, when the fog encountered the Kunlun seal, it was as if it was facing a great enemy, like a tiger, and they all avoided it. But in this underground ancient cave, especially when Lu Chen walked behind this huge ancient door, the darkness had been silently lingering around him. Even the golden light of the Kunlun seal could only illuminate a small area nearby. A little further away, the light seemed to be swallowed by the darkness, silently disappearing into the shadows. Lu Chen also heard the muffled sound of a door closing behind him. He knew that the ancient door had closed behind him. From this moment onwards, everything suddenly became quiet, and there was only darkness in front of him where he couldn't even see his own fingers. Lu Chen took 2 steps back, and his back leaned against the incomparably hard door. A cold air seeped into his body through his clothes. For some reason, Lu Chen's body suddenly trembled, and then he discovered that the black flame hidden in his Dantian sea of qi suddenly jumped, as if it was stimulated by something, or perhaps it was awakened by something, and it slowly burned. In his eyes in the darkness, 2 clusters of black flames began to appear and burn fiercely. Lu Chen was taken aback. He quickly recalled that a few years ago, when he was still in the Kunlun party, the black fire in his body was suddenly awakened. He was also very shocked at that time, but he could not figure out where the black fire in his body, which was similar to the black fire in his body but had an obviously primitive and ancient aura, came from. Until today, he suddenly understood that the source of that power was here. In the depths of Kunlun Mountain, apart from the things that Supreme Lord Tianlan had told him in private, there was another side to the great secret that had been hidden for 1,000 years. His expression became somewhat strange and wonderful in the darkness, and an indescribable feeling emerged in his heart. After standing still for a moment, Lu Chen finally made up his mind and began to walk forward. The darkness was as deep as the sea, completely obscuring one's vision. As far as the eye could see, there was almost no light except for the Kunlun seal in his hand. Lu Chen could not see anything more than a foot around him. In the darkness, this place could be as wide as the sea, or as narrow as a shack. If he took one more step, he would hit the wall. Every step was taken very carefully, because in such darkness, he did not know whether his next step would be empty, whether he would step on a trap, or whether something strange would happen. However, from another angle, in a vast and empty space of darkness that had suddenly been magnified countless times, something moved slightly in the darkness. Looking up, the glimmer of light in the distance was swaying in the dark sea, slowly walking over. Lu Chen did not know how long he had walked or how far he had walked, but in his perception he seemed to have walked very far, and a lot of time had passed. However, he clearly remembered that on the night before he left Mount Celestial Dragon, Supreme Lord Tianlan had clearly told him that in this place, all his perceptions could be wrong. This place was different from the entire cultivation world of the Divine Land. This place was unique in this world. This was the territory of that thing. In any case, Lu Chen still felt that he had walked for a very long time, and he felt a little tired. However, he immediately realized that this feeling of fatigue should not have appeared after he walked. Years of cultivation had long tempered his body. Purely walking without any spiritual power consumption, he should not be tired even if he walked for 3 days and 3 nights. There was indeed something strange here. He stopped and looked around attentively. However, except for a few feet of space, he could not see anything else. Darkness surrounded him, and everything seemed to be silent. Suddenly, there was a flash of light. It was the light on the Kunlun seal in his palm, which suddenly swayed. Lu Chen immediately felt it and looked down at the Kunlun seal. He saw that the golden seal, which was originally shining with golden light, was now as lustrous as before, but the light it emitted could not penetrate the surrounding darkness. And this golden light, which had been very stable all the way, suddenly shook at this moment. The light on the golden seal flickered, like a human's heartbeat, or like the breathing of a beast, constantly expanding and contracting. Suddenly, Lu Chen seemed to hear something. It was a movement that slowly came from the deepest part of the darkness. Hiss! The sound was not loud, and it was a little vague, making it unclear and unreal. He faintly felt that there was something rubbing against the hard ground and rocks. And not long after, the sound disappeared, as if it had never existed. Was it an illusion? Lu Chen raised his head. Suddenly, a chill blew from the front. It was a cold wind, and it also carried a trace of indescribable fishy smell. Hiss! The same vague sound appeared again, but this time it was clearer and closer. Lu Chen even lowered his head to look at the ground under his feet, because at that moment, when the sound sounded, he actually felt the ground under his feet was slightly trembling. That sound seemed to be slowly approaching him in the darkness. A cold, tyrannical, and indifferent aura slowly seeped out of the darkness, and the darkness began to faintly roll in front of Lu Chen's eyes. In the distance, nearby, the ground trembled, and an incomparably huge shadow slid and slid. The shadow hovered like a mountain, surrounding the unusually small human figure in the middle. Lu Chen did not speak, nor did he shout. He just gritted his teeth, silently raised the Kunlun seal in his hand, raised it to the highest point, and then opened his palm. Golden light emitted from the Kunlun seal, shining brightly and solemnly. The surrounding sound quieted down, and after a moment, suddenly a light lit up beside Lu Chen. It was a white and dazzling light, reflecting the huge, pale teeth. Yes, it was the head of an almost indescribable giant beast that suddenly appeared beside Lu Chen. Its mouth was even twice the size of Lu Chen's, and its sharp fangs were exposed, reflecting the Kunlun seal. Hiss! The strange sound echoed again, and the huge shadow in the darkness slowly straightened its body in front of Lu Chen. Chapter 537. The thick fog looked very calm from the outside. At most, only the fog on the surface was rolling slowly. As for the situation inside the fog, it was impossible to see at all. Therefore, when most people saw this fog, they would subconsciously feel that there was something strange in it, or that there were all kinds of mechanisms and traps that were hard to guess. However, they would never think that there was anything wrong with the fog itself. However, this thick fog itself was a very strange existence. Not long after Black Dog entered the thick fog, he understood this. At that time, he took a few steps at the edge of the fog and even poked his head out to greet Oxen triumphantly. Then an accident happened. The fog around him seemed to have suddenly come to life, turning into something extremely terrifying and powerful. All of a sudden, it rushed in from all directions, grabbed Atsu's body, and then pulled Atsu into the depths of the thick fog. Caught off guard, Atsu was immediately grabbed, leaving only a hole in the shape of a dog's head at the edge of the fog outside. It was somewhat comical, and then it was quickly filled by other fog. After that, all that was left in front of Atsu's eyes was a blur. At the same time, countless terrifying and sharp whistling sounds rang out beside his ears, like the wailing of ghosts and the howling of wolves. There were also several cold auras that tightly hung onto his fur, twisting and twisting, wanting to drill into his body. It felt as if it had suddenly fallen into a nest of poisonous snakes, and there were suddenly tens of thousands of snakes around it. Of course, Atsu could not just sit and wait for death. Even if it could not, it was still roaring and struggling, desperately pulling. Needless to say, after the transformation, the big black dog's bloodline and strength were already at the top level of the holy beast of the southern border. Its strength was indeed different from the past. In addition to being caught off guard at the beginning, when Atsu began to struggle and resist, those strange things around it were not so easy to control it. Its muscles bulged, and its originally soft fur instantly became as tough as steel. Although the cold auras were powerful, they could not penetrate Atsu's body for a while. At the same time, Atsu roared and struggled madly. There was a series of deep, pa-pa-pa-pa sounds, but it was as if something in the fog around it had snapped. But one strand of fog was broken, and at the same time, another 5 or 10 strands of fog rushed over. In this thick fog, there seemed to be an unimaginable number of strange things that could not be seen clearly, and they were rushing over from all directions like countless ropes, madly binding Atsu's body. Atsu was still struggling, but his voice carried a sorrowful tone. At the same time, he felt a trace of worry in his heart. It's such a terrifying mist, and Lu Qin had walked in as well. Could something have happened to him? Otherwise, why would there be no movement for so long? After the fierce struggle of Atsu, the inside of the thick fog had become a mess. All the fog was spinning and rolling rapidly, and countless screams could be heard one after another. Even though Atsu tried his best to resist, he was still caught and dragged into the depths of the fog. Moreover, it could be seen that even though Atsu's struggles temporarily blocked the harm to his body, as time passed, there would only be one end for him. A trace of despair and sadness flashed across Atsu's eyes. It was unknown whether it had thought at that moment that it was a dog that dominated the world, but now it died here so unjustly. It was too shameful. The fog rolled around, not caring about the sensitive dog at all. It was single-mindedly focused on grabbing this hard-won delicacy. After a long stalemate, just when Atsu was about to give up, a low cry suddenly came from the fog behind it. Moo! Oxen's huge body walked out of the fog. The strange thing was that the terrifying and arrogant fog, for some reason, was attacking the black dog crazily, but when it saw Oxen, it would all move aside. Occasionally, when there was fog that could not move away in time, Oxen would often just look at it, smack its lips, open its mouth, and spit out a ball of flame, burning the fog completely. Oxen's pace seemed slow, but it was actually very fast. In just a few steps, it had reached the side of Atsu, which was firmly bound by the thick fog. The fog that entangled its body did not move away, but still held on tightly to Atsu, as if it was reluctant to let go. Without any hesitation, Oxen opened its mouth and spat out a mouthful of golden flame. In an instant, there was a bone-chilling scream in the air, and the fog's tentacles were turned into nothingness. The black dog fell heavily to the ground with a plop. The thick fog shook violently, and those sharp cries went straight to the sky, as if there was something extremely angry roaring at Oxen. In response, Oxen's reaction was very arrogant, as if it could not even be bothered to respond. It only lowered its head to look at Atsu, then kicked Atsu's butt with its hoof. Atsu, which was a little dizzy from the fall, suddenly shivered and jumped up. When it saw Oxen standing beside it, Its eyes instantly widened. Then, it looked at the strange thick fog around it, and Atsu's mouth opened wide. When it looked at Oxen again, its eyes were filled with awe. It looked just like when it first walked to the small mountain filled with spirit beasts on Kunlun Mountain and looked up at Oxen at the top of the mountain. This was not an ordinary oxen, it was a god in the spirit beast world. Being stared at by this black dog with such a fervent and admiring gaze, even Oxen could not stand it. It let out a low moo, then turned around and prepared to leave. Atsu hurriedly followed. It stuck closely to Oxen's side and walked together with it. The fog around them surged, and screams were heard one after another, filled with anger and helplessness. However, just as this matter was about to end, suddenly, there was a sudden fluctuation in the thick fog in front of them. A moment later, a few screams were heard, followed by a series of intense fighting sounds. Then, the fog around Oxen suddenly paused, and like a gust of wind, it swept past them and rushed toward the place where the sounds came from. The scene was a little terrifying, as if a group of hungry sharks had smelled fresh blood and were madly rushing toward their prey. Atsu stopped and looked in that direction, then turned to look at Oxen. Oxen also stopped and looked in that direction. They were spirit beasts, so their ears were very sensitive. They clearly heard the sound earlier. It was a young girl's scream. At this moment, the only one who could make such a sound was White Lotus. She came in as well. Oxen raised its head and rolled its eyes as if it wanted to leave, but when it looked down at the black dog, it realized that Atsu was standing there hesitantly. Oxen looked at Atsu, and Atsu felt its gaze. After a moment of hesitation, it wagged its tail and made a few deep sounds at Oxen. Oxen looked at Atsu quietly for a moment, then nodded and walked in the direction of the sound. Chapter 5:38. Oxen took a few steps forward and suddenly looked back, only to find that the black dog had also followed it and was right beside it. Oxen hesitated for a moment, but it shook its head and let out a low moo. It stopped and did not continue to move forward. Instead, it swung its tail and patted Atsu's head, then turned around and walked in the other direction. Atsu was a little stunned, but it still followed it. Just like that, it followed Oxen for a while and walked out of the thick fog. However, this place was, of course, not the top of the hill where it had just entered. Looking at the surroundings, it was somewhat similar to the place where White Lotus was standing just now. Oxen brought Atsu here. When it felt that it was safe, it barked at it twice, then turned around and walked back into the thick fog. Its meaning seemed very clear. It probably felt that it should bring Atsu out first. After staying in the thick fog for a long time, it was always dangerous. Even if it wanted to save two people at the same time, it would be a little difficult. Atsu seemed to understand what Oxen meant, so after the initial surprise, it quickly calmed down. However, it still looked at the thick fog anxiously. After Oxen turned around and entered again, the fog seemed to have calmed down again, at least from the outside. What kind of strange thing was hidden in this thick fog? It was so strange and terrifying, and it was in the depths of the 1,000-year-old Kunlun party. It was really hard to imagine. It was also very puzzling. Why did the Kunlun party allow this thing to exist here for so many years? Atsu waited for a while, but there was still no sign of Oxen coming out. This made it a little anxious, but it did not dare to enter the thick fog again. In the end, it simply lay down on the ground. In its heart, it thought of Lu Chen who had entered this mysterious forbidden area earlier. It wondered how he was doing now. Lu Chen didn't feel good. While Atsu was worried that Lu Chen would be hurt by the fog, Lu Chen had actually passed through the dangerous fog with the help of the Kunlun seal and arrived at the deepest part of the earth, which was the biggest secret hiding place in Kunlun Mountain. However, this place seemed to be the deepest darkness in the world, and even light couldn't penetrate it. In his mind's imagination, especially after passing through the ancient and huge door in front of him, he felt that he should be in an unprecedentedly huge underground cave, even bigger than the cave he saw in the mysterious city below the celestial city. But all of this was just his conjecture. In fact, he knew nothing more than 3 feet around him. The darkness here was so thick that it blocked almost all of his senses. At the same time, there was another mysterious force that constantly interfered with his perception. Rationally, he kept telling himself that this should be a huge space, but in reality, Lu Chen always felt that there seemed to be an extra wall around him, a dark and high wall. Many times, he would hit a hard wall if he took a step, and maybe the next step would be a dead end, until an indescribable giant beast suddenly appeared in the darkness. In Lu Chen's mind, the invisible high walls around him seemed to have suddenly turned into a huge mountain, tightly sandwiching him in the middle. He stopped in his tracks and subconsciously tightened his body. There was nothing he could do. Even though he had always had a strong will, the huge mouth and fangs that were right in front of him, as well as the unimaginably huge body in the darkness, made him feel insignificant. It was an instinctive reaction. However, this unknown giant beast that suddenly appeared from the darkness did not seem to be like those bloodthirsty beasts that directly crushed the little ant in front of it with the force of a thunderbolt. Instead, it remained motionless after it appeared. After a moment of calmness, Lu Chen immediately raised his arm. He raised one arm towards the sky and slowly raised it up high. In his palm was the Kunlun seal that was flickering with golden light. As he slowly raised it up high, it lit up and seemed to brighten up the surroundings. In the surrounding darkness, there seemed to be a flash of lightning. A moment later, a light suddenly emerged from the darkness, and then gradually became clear. It was a huge eye, right above the huge mouth. It seemed that since the beginning, this giant beast had only placed its head next to Lu Chen, but did not open its eyes. The eye was very big, but the pupil was strangely long and thin. The surroundings were golden, but the pupil was unfathomably dark, like the pupil of a snake. Lu Chen raised the Kunlun seal to the highest point he could reach. Other than that, he remained silent and did not speak. The strange and huge eye set its eyes on the Kunlun seal. The golden light was reflected in its pupil, like a burning flame. Then, like a thunder from the depths of the sky, a voice with a soul-shaking power echoed in Lu Chen's ears, saying, "Who are you, Tianlan?" Lu Chen frowned, only feeling a faint buzzing sound in his ears. He hurriedly ran his spiritual force, and after a while, this discomfort was suppressed. Then he said in a clear voice, "My name is Lu Chen, a disciple of perfected Lord Tianlan." There seemed to be a trace of surprise in the huge eye. It looked at Lu Chen with some strange and complicated emotions and said, "Doesn't he never accept disciples?" Lu Chen said, "Earlier this year, he accepted me on Sky Dragon Mountain in the Immortal City." Hiss. A strange sound came from around, as if the body of the huge beast was slowly moving. At the same time, there seemed to be a slightly mocking laugh in the darkness, and then the huge beast said in a low voice, "It seems that even he can't stand to be alone for the rest of his life." Speaking of this, the huge beast paused, then looked at Lu Chen and said, "What's your name?" "Lu Chen." The huge beast shook its head slowly and said, "Not this. It's the Taoist name he gave you." Lu Chen was stunned for a moment. He did not expect that the gigantic beast in front of him would know about the inheritance of the Tian Taoist name like the back of his hand. It was obvious that perfected Lord Tianlan had an unimaginably close relationship with this ancient beast that had been hiding in the depths of Kunlun Mountain for countless years. After hesitating for a moment, Lu Chen decided to tell the truth. "Tianing." The huge beast seemed to think about this Taoist name for a while, then suddenly laughed in a low voice, but Lu Chen could not tell whether it was sarcasm or praise in its laughter. After a while, the huge beast said lightly, "For many years, those who inherited this Taoist name, Tian, did not have a good ending. Don't regret it." Lu Chen's body trembled slightly. He looked up at the strange huge eye high up in the sky and suddenly asked, "My master and I are still alive, and I'm not familiar with the past of my ancestors. However, I've heard that my grandmaster ancestor Tian Hong died of old age and passed away safely under the care of his two personal disciples." In the darkness, the huge beast looked at him. After a while, it said coldly, "Do you believe Tianlan's words?" Chapter 539. Did you believe Tianlan's words? After so many years, Did you still believe that damn Baldy? From that little boy to the shadow that blended into the darkness, from a wandering street to a cold-blooded killer, how many years have passed together? Now let me ask you, is he still trustworthy? Is he really trustworthy? Lu Chen stared at the strange huge eye in the air, his face expressionless and unusually calm. After a while, he said, "I believe you." Haha. The giant beast in the dark sneered. Its huge body hidden in the shadows seemed to move again, oppressing the earth and making it tremble slightly. It seemed that it might collapse like a hill at any time and crush Lu Chen, who was trapped in the center, into pieces. However, the hill did not collapse. Except for a few sneers, the giant beast did not do anything else and just remained silent to Lu Chen. After a while, it said coldly, "Why didn't Tianlan come to see me himself?" Obviously, Lu Chen had had a very in-depth conversation with Supreme Tianlan before he came here, so he did not hesitate to answer the question of the giant dark beast. He answered directly, "He can't leave." Now the situation in the Immortal City seems calm, but in fact, undercurrents are surging. We can't afford to be careless. My master must stay in the Immortal City and can't leave. The giant beast snorted, obviously disapproving of this reason. In fact, in the eyes of this level of giant beast, the power struggles that human beings valued were only ridiculous. But other than that, it did not have any other reaction. It just asked again, "Then what are you doing here?" Lu Chen took a deep breath and tightened the Kunlun seal on his palm. Then he said, "My master asked me to tell you that it's time." In the dark world, because of the light of the Kunlun seal, the strange eye of the giant beast, and the conversation between Lu Chen and the giant beast, this originally cold and lonely world had some business. However, after Lu Chen said those words, everything around him seemed to have suddenly changed. The light was still the same, and the figure was still the same, but the atmosphere had completely changed. All sounds disappeared at that moment, and the dark world seemed to have fallen into a dead silence. After a moment, the huge snake-like eye also disappeared. Then there was the sound of thunder, suddenly drifting from the darkness, from far to near, rumbling. Then, the darkness suddenly rolled, and a tall figure like a huge mountain appeared in front of Lu Chen. It was almost impossible to see the whole figure, but the golden light of the Kunlun seal seemed to have been unlocked at this moment. Suddenly, the light shone brightly and shot toward the surroundings, illuminating the dark world. Lu Chen held his breath and stared ahead. At the border between the brilliant golden radiance and the endless darkness, a huge shadow descended. In the depths of his pupils, that shocking scene was reflected. An indescribably huge black dragon slowly appeared in front of him. The dragon's breath was like a thunderclap, and the huge dragon's claws pressed on the ground, causing the rocks to crack. This kind of terrible and terrifying creature should never exist in this world, because they always seem to have the power to easily destroy the world. Its body seemed to have an ancient and wild aura, as if it had come from ancient times and suddenly appeared in this world. The dragon race, which once only existed in myths and legends, appeared in front of Lu Chen for the first time. The time has come? The rumbling sound was like rolling thunder, slowly rolling over the top of Lu Chen's head, and the huge dragon's head fell down. This time, it was a pair of dragon eyes that lit up, and Lu Chen could even see the surprise and disappointment in those eyes. Perhaps it had been waiting for this day for far too long. Lu Chen clenched the Kunlun seal in his hand, nodded, and then said, "Yes, the time has come. Master asked me to tell you, and then said that if you are willing, you can come with me to the Immortal City." In the forbidden area between the clouds and the sky, oxen walked in the thick fog, and it did not seem to be in a hurry at all. Although it had taken some time to bring Atsu out of the thick fog, it did not seem to care. Even if there was another girl waiting for its rescue in the thick fog, oxen seemed to be full of confidence. It was as if this bull would always be so unhurried. It walked confidently, and along the way, the fog avoided it, and it did not encounter any resistance or obstacles along the way. Of course, there was no danger to speak of. The fog that was so dense that it could make people lose their sense of direction did not seem to have any effect on the green ox. At most, it raised its head and probed the air a few times. Then, it quickly determined the direction and walked in that direction. Not long after, it heard the sounds of an intense struggle. At this time, it was impossible for anyone else to be struggling in the fog except for White Lotus. Oxen walked in that direction, and in a few steps, it saw the figure of White Lotus in the depths of the fog, who was trying her best to resist the monsters in the surrounding fog. A gust of cold air blew in its face, and Oxen stopped in its tracks. It was the cold air that was emitted from White Lotus's body, and all the fog that was pouncing on her was somewhat afraid of this kind of cold air, and for a moment, it could do nothing to her. However, White Lotus was also flustered, and it was obvious that her breathing was not calm, and her follow-up was weak. It seemed that after a while, she would be exhausted and defeated. Oxen walked straight over. Suddenly, there was a loud howl in the thick fog, and it seemed to be extremely angry, and it roared at Oxen crazily. However, Oxen ignored it and only walked all the way to White Lotus's side. On the way, there were a few clouds of fog that seemed to be unable to bear it and blocked its way. Oxen directly spat a few mouthfuls of flames at them, burning them completely. White Lotus also saw the figure of Oxen, and especially when she saw Oxen's actions, a look of shock and awe flashed across her eyes. She had never seen such a powerful giant beast before. Oxen walked to her side, and the surrounding fog that had been attacking endlessly retreated angrily but helplessly, giving way to an empty space. White Lotus finally breathed a sigh of relief, and her body suddenly became weak, and she almost sat on the ground. Oxen glanced at her, and then signaled White Lotus to get on its back. White Lotus was startled for a moment, and she was a little hesitant. After all, she was not familiar with this oxen, but now that it was a matter of life and death, there was no room for hesitation, so she quickly climbed up. Then, Oxen turned around and left. The surrounding fog chased after it, but it did not dare to get close, and from time to time, there were shrill and angry cries, looking flustered and exasperated. On the back of the ox, White Lotus breathed a sigh of relief, and at the same time, a complicated expression flashed across her face. The giant beast under her was the most powerful creature she had ever seen in her life, and it was far stronger than the low-level magical beasts and monsters that she had encountered when she was cultivating the blood food secret technique. She seemed to be a little uneasy. She thought of her fate of wandering around all these years. Suddenly, something moved on her neck. She looked down and found that it was a twig that she wore on her body. She did not know how it had fallen out during the fierce battle just now, and now it was hanging in front of her chest. She stared at this ancient branch and did not speak for a long time. Chapter 540. The black dog felt that the night was exceptionally long, and time was passing extremely slowly. Whether it was Lu Qin or that oxen, neither of them responded to the thick fog after entering it. They did not return for a long time. There were several times when it could not help but stand up and walk to the edge of the thick fog, wanting to go in and search again. However, every time it recalled its embarrassing appearance in the thick fog, it could not help but shrink back. If it was not for Oxen's rescue, Atsu would probably have been trapped in the thick fog and could not extricate itself. However, when Atsu recalled the encounter just now, it felt a little annoyed and unwilling. Because when Atsu was in the thick fog, it could feel that its strength was actually not weaker than those strange creatures hidden in the fog. However, the reason why it was in such a predicament was that it could not fight back at all. First, there were too many of them hiding in the fog, and it was almost impossible to defend against them. Second, it was as if all its struggles were hitting the air, and it could not exert any strength at all. Thinking of this, Atsu was also annoyed, but it still took 2 steps back subconsciously. This fog was really a bit strange. If only it could directly spit fire like oxen and burn those strange creatures to death. Atsu was suddenly startled. It stood still and looked back at the fog, seemingly a little lost in thought. After a while, it slowly walked back to the edge of the fog. It seemed to be a little hesitant, but in the end, it quickly made up its mind. Its broad and strong body stood straight, and then a trace of darkness suddenly flashed across its eyes. It looked like a ball of black fireworks. I've been waiting for this day for a long, long time. A thunderous voice echoed in this dark underground world. In Lu Chen's eyes, the unimaginably huge black dragon, the terrifying creature that should not exist in this world, seemed to have fallen into a memory at this moment, recalling the things that happened many, many years ago. Most of its huge body was hidden in the darkness, but just the part that was revealed was enough to strike fear into people's hearts. It was like a towering mountain. Lu Chen even subconsciously thought of all the things he had experienced in his life. Due to various reasons, he was far more experienced and knowledgeable than ordinary people, including some strange creatures that most people in this world had never seen or heard of. For example, the Great Snowy Mountain, the legendary Heavenly Wolf, and all kinds of strange monsters hidden in the abyss, all of them gave people a soul-stirring feeling. However, those creatures seemed rather normal compared to the black dragon in front of them. No matter how one looked at it, this black dragon was a legendary monster that belonged to the imagination of humans. It should never have existed in this world. However, at this moment, Lu Chen was facing it so seriously. Then he heard the dragon reply, "I'm going to the Celestial City." This reply was clear and could not possibly have any other meaning. In fact, this reply completely matched the prediction that perfected Lord Tianlan had made before Lu Chen set off. Lu Chen clearly remembered that he had asked perfected Lord Tianlan what to do if the black dragon did not agree to come. Perfected Lord Tianlan had smiled and said very calmly, "If it's not willing to come, then let it be. However, it will definitely come." Reality once again proved that perfected Lord Tianlan's judgment was correct. Sometimes, Lu Chen would wonder if this damn Baldy had ever made a wrong decision on an important matter after so many years. If he had to make an enemy of someone who almost always made the right decision, how terrifying would that be? Now that things had come to this, although Lu Chen did not know why the Black Dragon wanted to go to the Celestial City, nor did he understand what perfected Lord Tianlan meant by telling him that the time has come, the most important thing for him right now was not to think about these useless things. He had to prepare to bring the Black Dragon to the Celestial City. If such a huge dragon were to head to the Celestial City just like that, the commotion could be said to be earth-shattering. However, it seemed that neither the Black Dragon nor perfected Lord Tianlan, who was far away in the Celestial City, had any intention of doing so. Lu Chen had already been briefed, so he very quickly threw the Kunlun seal in his hand into the air. The shining golden seal flipped in the air and flew to the front of the huge dragon. Then, it suddenly stopped, as if it had been grabbed by a force. The black dragon leaned forward as if it was about to make a move. However, at that moment, its eyes suddenly narrowed and it raised its head. It seemed to be slightly surprised. After a while, the huge dragon's head slowly descended and stopped in front of Lu Chen. Lu Chen looked at the sharp fangs not too far away from him and frowned slightly. He took a step back and then asked, "What's wrong?" The black dragon stared at him. After a while, it suddenly said, "I smell the aura of the black fire." Black fire? Lu Chen was stunned. Then, he was shocked and his expression changed slightly. The black dragon did not continue to speak to him. Instead, it stared at him. After a moment, suddenly, in the dragon's eyes, in that strange, slender snake pupil, a ball of black flames suddenly shot out. Yes, it was a ball of black fire. No one, at least in the world that Lu Chen knew of, no one knew the source of the black fire. Even Lu Chen himself, who possessed this strange power, was still in a very unfamiliar state with the black fire. He did not know the origin of the black fire, did not understand its origin, and did not know what the black fire would become in the future. He only used an almost instinctive ability to control the black fire. This ancient and strange power had saved him many times. Now, it had almost become his greatest and final trump card. However, this black fire power did not belong to him alone. As far as he knew, there were at least 3 other black fire powers in this world. One was the Dead Fire Shaman, the second was the Black Fire Tribe in the distant southern wilderness, and the last was the Black Dog that followed him. What was funny was that other than the Dead Fire Shaman and the Black Fire Tribe, Lu Chen and Atu's black fire energy had come from an unknown and strange place, so much so that they couldn't explain it. Until today, when Lu Chen suddenly sensed the power of the fourth black fire in this world. Moreover, the power of the black fire was so strong, pure, and clean. It was as if the black fire had just been born. It naturally carried an ancient and wild aura, just like the black dragon. Then, as if it was summoned by the primitive but powerful black fire power, Lu Chen suddenly found that the black fire in his body seemed to have gone out of control. It suddenly rose up, and when he was caught off guard, his eyes also burned with a raging black fire. At that moment, Lu Chen suddenly thought of the experience when the black fire in his body was suddenly awakened on the mountain of Kunlun a long time ago. That feeling was almost the same as now. The black dragon looked at him condescendingly. Its eyes seemed to be very complicated. After a while, he heard the black dragon slowly say, "Why does the disciple of Tianlan not have his divine sense, but the power of our dragon tribe?" Chapter 541. The Power of the Dragon Clan? When Lu Chen heard the black dragon's words, his first reaction was to wonder if he had misheard. Ever since he first came into contact with the power of the black fire in the Barren Valley over 10 years ago, he still wasn't very clear about the origin and history of the black fire. However, he at least knew that the black fire had never had anything to do with the legendary dragon clan in the past 10 years. If he really had to say that it was related to the legend, then when he wandered into the southern wilderness and stayed with the barbarians, the ancient legend of the Black Fire tribe was that the black fire originated from the fire god was the only exception. However, the fire god that the Black Fire tribe worshipped was clearly not the same as the huge black dragon in front of him. At the very least, in the many years that Lu Chen lived in the Black Fire tribe, he had never seen a statue or totem in the shape of a dragon. This was impossible for a tribe that had always had a firm belief in the southern wilderness. However, the Black Fire tribe's current attitude was clearly very confident in this matter. His tone was as if it was only natural and without any hesitation. This caused Lu Chen to hesitate. After all, no matter how he looked at it, the black dragon didn't seem to have any reason to lie to him. Then, Lu Chen suddenly frowned as he thought of something. Apart from the first 10 years when he was tormented to the point where he wished he was dead, Lu Chen discovered that the power of the black fire was extremely strange after he subdued it. It was different from any Dao or magical power that he knew of in the world. This was because it didn't seem to need to cultivate. Most of the time, the black fire would peacefully hide in Lu Chen's body without a trace. Even true Lord Tianlan, who had the ability to see through the heavens and earth, would find it difficult to detect the strangeness in Lu Chen's body. However, when Lu Chen was in danger, he could quickly activate this power and use it to suppress his enemies. Lu Chen had tried many methods, including many cultivation methods from the human cultivation world, to test the black fire, but it was useless. Later on, Lu Chen found the only way to make the black fire grow: killing and death. Every time he killed someone or killed another living being, his body would automatically absorb a strange power. Most of the time, it was very weak, but it was definitely there. It would slowly nourish the black fire, allowing it to grow. It made one's hair stand on end. Even Lu Chen himself felt very uncomfortable. Even though he felt like he was some kind of monster that sucked blood to live, he still felt like he was a blood-sucking monster. But the truth was that the black fire was not a righteous power. It had always leaned towards the darkness. Just like Lu Chen had always been unable to break away from it, even though he was standing under the sunlight. Even in his heart, he often felt that standing in the shadows made him feel more comfortable. As for whether the power of the black fire belonged to the dragon race, Lu Chen really did not know. He quickly came to his senses and just shook his head slightly. He had no intention of arguing with the black dragon on this matter. The black dragon looked at him, seemingly not surprised by Lu Chen's reaction. However, when it looked at the young man, there seemed to be a slightly more complicated look in its eyes. "Let's go," the black dragon said. Then, the black shadows around its body suddenly shook, and there was an endless gurgling sound. Such a huge dragon began to shrink in front of Lu Chen. In the middle of the swaying light and shadow, the mountain-like body rapidly shrank. The golden light of the Kunlun seal became more and more dazzling, as if it had also sensed something. Soon, accompanied by a rumbling sound, the black dragon suddenly turned into a shadow and pounced on the golden light. Then, it quickly disappeared in the golden light. The Kunlun seal paused in midair for a moment. Then all the light suddenly disappeared, and it turned around and fell down. Lu Chen quickly reached out and caught it. He put it on his palm and looked at it carefully. The Kunlun seal was still the original Kunlun seal, but at this moment, the golden light around it had changed. Not only was it greatly reduced, but even the ordinary light had dimmed. Looking at it, the Kunlun seal seemed to have lost all its spiritual energy and became an inconspicuous piece of stone. Lu Chen didn't reveal any expression of worry. Instead, he seemed to have heaved a sigh of relief. He carefully wrapped the Kunlun seal and kept it in his robes before turning around and walking away. The way back was much easier. Although it was still very dark, it was obvious that the black dragon was the ruler of this mysterious underground world. Once it decided to leave with Lu Chen, the silence and peace of this place was quickly broken. The monsters in the thick fog were obviously more active. They all seemed to be growling in a low voice. Although the Kunlun seal was not in his hands, its power was still there. Even if it was hidden in Lu Chen's arms, it could still intimidate the surrounding monsters, allowing Lu Chen to walk out safely. After returning to the surface and leaving the dark and vast underground world, Lu Chen still breathed a sigh of relief. But soon, he became nervous again and smiled bitterly. No matter what, carrying such a huge dragon with him would not make him feel relaxed. Lu Chen walked out of the thick fog. Wherever he passed, the fog would retreat. Not long after, he finally walked out of the forbidden area between the sky and the clouds. During this process, although the surrounding fog seemed to be abnormally active, hissing and moving, until the end, there was still not a trace of fog that broke through the invisible boundary. Obviously, the person who set up various restrictive means here was an extremely powerful ancestor of the Kunlun party in the previous generation. Then Lu Chen saw it. Atsu looked safe and sound as it squatted a few feet away from the thick fog. Beside it stood Oxen and another beautiful girl. It was White Lotus. Seeing White Lotus and Oxen also standing here, Lu Chen could not help but be startled, but he did not take it to heart. He glanced at White Lotus, then smiled and walked towards Atsu. He first reached out and touched the head of Atsu, who stood up happily and wagged its tail at him. Then he walked over and patted Oxen's head, saying with a smile, "Hello, old friend." Oxen glanced at him and let out a moo. Then, Lu Chen turned around and said to Atsu, "Things are done, Atsu, let's go back to the immortal city." Atsu barked twice, nodded and wagged its tail without any objection, but at this moment, Lu Chen suddenly felt his sleeve tighten. He looked down and saw that Oxen had walked to his side and bit his sleeve. "What's wrong?" Lu Chen asked it. Oxen barked, then pointed to the north. Lu Chen thought carefully, and his expression changed slightly. With a hint of doubt, he asked, "You also want to go to the immortal city with us?" Oxen nodded. Lu Chen was stunned. This Oxen's identity and origin were extraordinary. It was a spiritual beast that Supreme Lord Tianlan had raised for many years, and its cultivation was unfathomable. In the entire Kunlun mountain range, it was second to none. Did it want to go to the immortal city to see its master, Supreme Lord Tianlan? But when Supreme Lord Tianlan told him to come over, he did not say anything about this oxen. Should he take it with him? Lu Chen hesitated for a moment, but he did not notice that White Lotus, who had been standing at the side without saying a word, was still looking at this oxen from time to time, and there was a glimmer in the depths of her eyes. Chapter 542. Although Oxen's sudden request was somewhat abrupt and surprising, Lu Chen did not dwell on it for too long. Anyway, this bull was Supreme Tianlan's pet. Although he did not know why every time Tianlan left Kunlun Mountain for the Immortal City, he did not bring Oxen with him and left it in Kunlun Mountain. But when the time came, as long as he said that Oxen had followed him, Supreme Tianlan would not say anything. Lu Chen had known this oxen for a long time. He had seen it when he was young, so he felt some affection for it. So he finally nodded, patted Oxen, and agreed. Oxen mooed and seemed to be in a good mood. Atsu also seemed to be very happy. Then, Luchin looked at White Lotus, who was standing at the side. He wanted to say something but stopped. After a moment of silence, he turned back to Oxen and Atsu and said, "Let's go back to the immortal city." He emphasized some words in this sentence and then walked forward. From beginning to end, he did not speak to White Lotus, as if he was somewhat ignoring this young girl. Atsu wagged its tail and followed. Before Oxen took a step, it suddenly glanced at the mountain in the distance where Winter Peak had once crashed. But it did not have any further reaction and followed behind Luchin. One man and two beasts walked for a while. Luchin heard footsteps coming from behind. He sighed in his heart and then stopped to look back. White Lotus caught up from behind and walked to his side without saying a word. She stared at him with a calm expression. Luchin frowned and said, "You also want to go back to the immortal city with me?" White Lotus nodded. Although she did not say much, her expression was calm, as if what she said was a matter of course. Her tone was very firm. Luchin looked at her and after a while he said, "Why bother? It's been so hard for you to get the chance to come out." White Lotus said, "I have nowhere else to go." Luchin shook his head and said, "No matter how big the world is, there will always be a place for you." White Lotus snorted and said, "The world is so big. If I offend that person, there will be no place for me to stand." Luchin stared into her eyes and said after a while, "That's not right." White Lotus sneered, "Of course you don't care, you're not me. You're high and mighty with power in your hands, and you're in high spirits. How would you understand my situation?" She seemed to be a little angry. She clenched her teeth and said, "You can't go home. You can't sleep at night. You can't even tell if you'll live or die tomorrow. Do you understand?" "I understand," Luchin said. There was a sudden silence between the two. Oxen and Black Dog, who were standing to the side, seemed to have noticed something and looked in their direction. White Lotus stared at Luchin, her chest rising and falling slightly. Her expression was one of surprise and anger. Luchin, however, didn't seem to care about her expression. He only said calmly, "The world is so big. How can there be no place for me to stand?" White Lotus's expression darkened. She snorted and said, "I'm not like you, a loner. I have a big family behind me. If I can run, can they run too?" Luchin wasn't moved by this deep and warm family bond at all. He didn't even show the slightest change in his expression. He said, "I don't believe it. If losing the Bai family could help you get rid of that damn Baldy, you wouldn't even blink. Don't talk to me about this." White Lotus was so angry that she almost jumped up. She pointed at Luchin and scolded, "Do you think everyone is as cold-blooded as you?" Luchin said, "Of course not. You're the only one who is like me." White Lotus was speechless. She rolled her eyes and the anger on her face disappeared. Just as she was thinking about what to say, she saw that Luchin had turned around and continued to walk forward. White Lotus frowned and caught up with him. She said, "What do you mean by this?" Luchin didn't look at her. He just looked at the towering dark mountains in the distance and said lightly, "You're not anyone to me. I just said a few words casually. Whether you return to the immortal city or not, it has nothing to do with me." White Lotus was silent. In the deep night, they still walked together, even if they each had their own thoughts. There were some words that they didn't say out loud. Perhaps they didn't need to say much. They were all smart people and understood in their hearts. How could there be so many excuses? How could there be so many reasons? The reason why they didn't want to take risks and return to the most prosperous and noisy giant city in the world was because they were unwilling to give up. They were reluctant to give up their talents and the expectations they had since they were young. Since they had tasted the taste of the infinitely beautiful scenery at the peak, how could they be willing to return to mediocrity for the rest of their lives? It was said that if you take a step back, the sea and the sky would be wide open. But under the vast sea and sky, you, after all, are just a tiny ant. When they walked further and further in the night and were about to disappear into the night, A figure suddenly emerged from the darkness on the earthen mountain at the edge of the forbidden area. With the help of the glimmer of light, it could be seen that this was the acting head of the Kunlun party, Immortal Qian Deng. There was no one beside him. He stood alone on the top of the earthen mountain. After his appearance, the strange thick fog seemed to be stirred. It suddenly rolled, like a pack of hungry wolves showing their ferocious faces to the food not far away. However, the invisible boundary still firmly blocked them. In the end, the fog could not cross the boundary. Immortal Qian Deng didn't seem to care about the fog. He frowned slightly and looked at Lu Chen and the others who had entered the most important forbidden area of the Kunlun party. For some reason, he didn't make it difficult for them to stay. Very soon, the figures of Lu Chen and the others finally disappeared into the night. Immortal Qian Deng shook his head. The expression on his face was complicated. He seemed to be full of thoughts. He turned around and looked at the extremely thick fog. A strange light flashed in the depths of his eyes. How many more secrets were hidden in the majestic Kunlun under the 1,000-year-old sect? On the same night, tens of thousands of miles away on the Four Rivers Plain, the magnificent immortal city was still bustling and noisy. Even in the dead of night, it was still brightly lit. In the Kunlun Hall on Mount Celestial Dragon, true Lord Tunlun, who was sitting cross-legged on a lotus throne, suddenly felt uneasy. He was unexpectedly a bit agitated. As if he sensed something, he calmed down and pondered for a moment. Then he got down from the lotus throne and floated to the ground. Then he slowly walked out of the Kunlun Hall. It was quiet all around. The night was dark. He stood in front of the grand hall and looked up at the sky. He didn't know when it started, but a red light suddenly appeared and crossed the sky. Then the red light was like a tide, covering the sky and the sun. It filled half of the sky, and just like a few days ago, it divided the entire sky into two halves. No, it was not two complete halves. On the ground, the burly bald man in a loose robe quietly looked at the night sky. He watched as the originally straight red line slowly surged forward like the waves of the sea. Wave after wave, it rushed through the center line and covered more of the night sky. It only stopped when it covered about 10% of the sky. The blood-red sky once again appeared in the human world. It was reflected in his eyes like a strange painting. One could also faintly see that the corners of his mouth were slightly raised, revealing a trace of a strange smile. Chapter 543. Lu Chen and his group left Kunlun Mountain under the cover of the night. They did not delay on their journey as they moved forward in the direction of the Immortal City. However, the Immortal City was still thousands of miles away from the Western Land. Although they were all cultivators, it would still take them a long time to get there. As a famous mountain sect, Kunlun Mountain was inextricably linked to Lu Chen and White Lotus. However, for some reason, the two of them did not seem to have any nostalgia for this place. They left without hesitation and even seemed to be eager to leave this place as soon as possible. They did not want to see this mountain again. About 3 days later, they finally left Kunlun Mountain behind. Even when they occasionally looked back, they could not see the mountain most of the time. Along the way, Atsu and Oxen followed them. Atsu was very interested in Oxen and often followed Oxen to communicate with it. Although they did not understand what Atsu barked meant, Oxen did not seem to hate this black dog. At most, it was too lazy to pay attention to it. In addition, Atsu would usually run to Lu Chen to get close to him for a while. Except for White Lotus, Atsu seemed to have always been very wary of White Lotus and would not easily get close to her. Of course, White Lotus also felt that Atsu was alienating them, but she did not care. During this period of time, the girl seemed to be a lot quieter. In fact, most of the time, she would often peek at Oxen from the side. On this day, they had walked for another day. In addition to the previous few days of rushing, both humans and beasts were a little tired. Lu Chen decided to rest tonight. Finally, he looked around and found a small forest by the side of the road to rest. The forest was not too big, but it was dense enough to shelter them from the wind. If there was no one to guide them, it was difficult to find people in the forest from the outside. On the contrary, People hiding in the forest could see the situation outside the forest more clearly. It could be regarded as a good place, hidden and safe. Lu Chen and White Lotus looked around and were very satisfied. As for Atsu and Oxen, Lu Chen decided not to ask for their opinions. In the end, everyone settled down in this forest and prepared to rest for the night before continuing their journey the next morning. When night fell, everyone had already settled down in the forest, roughly forming a triangle. Oxen was in one corner, White Lotus was in another corner, and Atsu was lying together with Lu Chen in the last corner. It was strange. Although Atsu and Oxen were almost glued together during the day, when it was time to sleep, Atsu would definitely run back to Lu Chen and stay by his side. Even if it was in a daze, it would still stay with Lu Chen. Perhaps this was also a kind of attachment? Lu Chen wasn't sure why Atsu was so dependent on him. However, they had been together for so many years, and they already had feelings for each other. Therefore, Lu Chen just let it be. In the dead of night, everyone fell asleep. Lu Chen and White Lotus were sleeping with their clothes on, Oxen was sleeping with its huge head on the ground, and Atsu was sleeping next to Lu Chen, using one of Lu Chen's thighs as a pillow. However, in this quiet moment, Atsu's ears suddenly moved, and then it suddenly opened its eyes. There was a faint green glow in its eyes, and the drowsiness it had before was suddenly gone, replaced by vigilance and hostility. It turned its head and looked around. In the dark forest, there seemed to be only the cold wind blowing from the treetops. Atsu stretched out its front foot and gently pushed Lu Chen's face. When Lu Chen opened his eyes, the first thing he saw was Atsu's eyes, which had a strange luster to them. Atsu was also looking at it, and its paw was still on Lu Chen's cheek. One person and one dog quietly looked at each other. After a while, the light in Lu Chen's eyes gradually brightened, and the little bit of sleepiness disappeared. After a while, he slowly nodded to Atsu. Atsu retracted its paw. Lu Chen raised his eyes and looked at the night sky. The night was dark, and the treetops and branches seemed to be covered in darkness. There was only the rustling sound of the wind, and the swaying branches seemed to be slightly more violent than before. Lu Chen frowned, turned over and sat up. When he looked to his left and right, he found that both White Lotus and Oxen were still sleeping at the moment, and they seemed to have not noticed any sound at all. Atsu turned its head and looked in a certain direction in the night, and Lu Chen immediately looked in that direction. It seemed to be the deepest part of the darkness, without a trace of light, but in Lu Chen's view, no matter what, it could not compare to the darkness in the underground world in the forbidden area of Kunlun. Because only the territory of the Black Dragon was the real darkness in the world, and even light could be swallowed. After leaving the Kunlun mountain, the Black Dragon entered the Kunlun seal and did not make any sound, as if it had disappeared. Along the way, Lu Chen secretly took out the golden seal to check, but just as he did on the way here, the Kunlun seal did not respond to his various tests. It seemed that only when it reached the Kunlun mountain, the Kunlun seal would change, especially in the sky, where the Kunlun seal could be said to have reached the peak of its power. At any other time, the Kunlun seal would be the same as now, half dead and unresponsive, and Lu Chen could not find where the huge black dragon was hiding at the moment. However, the more it was like this, the more interested Lu Chen was in the Kunlun seal. He also clearly knew that what he saw was not a trick, because in his body, there was another treasure buried deep in his heart, that strange seed, which also had a similar strange ability. But in between, he clearly knew that there was a world of difference between the two. In the seed was the ancient and mysterious tree hole. The size was less than the size of a common house. But if the black dragon could not change and shrink its body, then the strange space sealed in the Kunlun seal would be frighteningly big. Could there be such a shocking treasure in this world? As if in response to the thought in Lu Chen's mind, when he stood up, a ray of light suddenly lit up in the dark corner. Sword light. It pierced out from the depths of the darkness, and in an instant, the light shone brightly, and the sword turned into 10 swords, 100 swords, 1,000 swords, 10,000 swords. The wind howled, and in an instant, a row of more than 10 trees were blown down, forming a raging tide of sword light like a huge wave, sweeping towards Lu Chen. Amidst the sword glint in the wind, Amidst the mournful whistling, a pair of ice-cold eyes locked onto Lu Chen's body. Then, a voice came along with the wind, and it was as cold as the edge of a sword. Hand over the token of the sect leader. The next moment, the sword light directly drowned the land where Lu Chen was standing. Chapter 544. Sect Leader's Token? Before he was engulfed by the sword light, Lu Chen heard these 4 words. Even though his body reacted in an instant, the spiritual power went berserk, the black fire rose to resist this sudden attack, but Lu Chen's mind still involuntarily went blank and sluggish for a moment. In that instant, he immediately and nimbly went through his entire body once, every item, every magical weapon, including his biggest secret seed. He felt that none of them could be linked to the sect leader's token. And he did not even know what the sect leader's token that the assailant mentioned was. One must know this kind of thing may be a rare treasure, it may be a rare treasure, but it could also be some kind of inconspicuous thing passed down by the ancient ancestors. It was not worth much, but because it was sentimental, everyone valued it, and it became a treasured heavy weapon. But there was no such thing. The sword light was sharp and powerful, the person's cultivation was very high, and his attack was fierce. If Lu Chen did not judge the pressure he was under at this moment, this masked person who suddenly appeared in the dark could even be a Zhenren whose cultivation was in the realm of Yuanying. The Yuanying Zhenren who could walk unhindered in the divine continent's cultivation world, turned into an assassin and launched a sneak attack? This possibility, even for Lu Chen, could not help but feel a chill in his heart. That sword, the sword light was like a mountain, the sword shadow was like the sea, rolling over like a raging wave. The force of the sword was like thunder. Before it reached the front, there was already a sharp airflow rushing over, directly piercing his heart, causing his heart to feel so vexed that he almost vomited blood. Or perhaps he was really about to die in the dark night. At that critical moment, the black fire instantly burned in Lu Chen's eyes. Under his clothes, his originally smooth and complete flesh suddenly twisted, like the flat ground suddenly cracking, and then like magma black fire spewed out. He instantly turned into a black burning man. The black fire roared and roared. It was the only light that refused to yield in the sky full of sword light. In that extremely short moment, it was only a blink of an eye, the sword light had already collided. Boom! With a loud bang, Lu Chen's entire body was sent flying, and the sword radiance that filled the sky also retreated. After a moment, it slowly disappeared, and in the embers of the radiance, a man in black clothes and a black mask slowly appeared. The man's body swayed slightly, and a hint of surprise flashed through his eyes, as if he was surprised by the result just now. He did not immediately chase after Lu Chen. Instead, he stayed where he was for a while and steadied his body. It seemed that the attack just now had actually caused his qi and blood to surge, and he had suffered a slight backlash. But in comparison, on the other side, Lu Chen's situation was much worse. He was originally caught off guard by the sneak attack, but the opponent's skills were shockingly high, and his attacks were fierce and decisive. Lu Chen was at a disadvantage in almost every aspect. After doing his utmost to block this extremely powerful attack, Lu Chen flew backwards into the forest, breaking 3 or 4 trees in succession before falling to the ground. While he was still flying through the air, Lu Chen had already spat out a mouthful of blood. But when he landed in the forest, the raging black fire on his body had already shrunk back into his body. Under the dusky shade of the trees, he was like a ghost. After falling heavily to the ground, he almost did not have the slightest hesitation. His body suddenly twisted and turned. After rolling to the side in the darkness, he immediately blended into the surrounding shadows and actually disappeared. After a moment, the sword light whistled mournfully again. The masked assassin had already reached the place where Lu Chen had landed. However, there was only a mess left on the ground. Crushed grass and trees, broken branches, and a pool of dark red blood stained the ground. But Lu Chen was nowhere to be seen. That Lu Chen who was obviously injured by the sneak attack actually disappeared in a blink of an eye, hiding somewhere unknown. In the masked man's eyes, his pupils suddenly contracted, his eyes revealed surprise and anger. Obviously he did not expect Lu Chen to have such a strange method. He looked like a ghost. No, that method of hiding and escaping just now, from the beginning to the end, was filled with an evil aura. Obviously it was the secret method of the evil sect. With a long sword in his hand, he stood in the middle of the forest. His eyes were cold as he coldly looked around. In the dusky forest, the tree shadows quietly swayed, shadows everywhere, as if there were human figures everywhere, but also as if there were none. Only the wind quietly blowing in the depths of the darkness, like an ice-cold knife. The murderous aura was so cold that it made one's goosebumps rise. Then he heard a deep roar. The masked man's body paused for a moment and then turned his head to look, frowned slightly, his eyes cold. At the place where he came from, a big black dog was baring its fangs at him. The fur on its back stood up, opened its mouth to reveal its sharp fangs, like a ferocious beast that was about to pounce at any moment. That masked man did not have the slightest fear. Even his eyes showed some disgust. After confirming that Lu Chen was indeed very cunning, even if he had cultivated to this level, he still had no way to quickly locate him. The masked man turned his target to the black dog. He seemed to snort coldly, took 2 steps towards the Atsu with the sword in his hand. You might be able to learn a few tricks to hide here and there, but did this big dumb dog know it too? The long sword in his hand, the tip of the sword faintly flashed. The murderous aura was like a tide, gushing towards the Atsu. However, the next moment, suddenly, an even bigger shadow appeared out of nowhere. A huge soul stepped through the darkness, standing next to the black dog. Oxen walked out of the darkness, stood next to the black dog, and raised his head to look at the masked man. The masked man suddenly stopped in his tracks. He did not retreat, nor did he have the intention to escape. He did not even feel fear. He stared at the sudden appearance of the oxen, his brows slightly furrowed, as if he felt that this was a little troublesome. The murderous aura in the air did not disappear. It was still condensed around the masked man, gathered on the long sword that was as bright as autumn water. Oxen looked at the masked man standing in the darkness. He seemed to be a little cautious. Suddenly, both sides seemed to have fallen into a strange atmosphere of confrontation. No one spoke, no one made any movement, but in that oppressive atmosphere, the long sword in the masked man's hand slowly flickered. It seemed to gradually start to brighten again. Suddenly, Oxen let out a moo sound, took a step forward. There was a faint sound of wind blowing around it. It was also at this moment, in the darkness further away, suddenly, a white figure swayed. The masked man looked in that direction, and suddenly was startled. It was a beautiful young girl. It was White Lotus, hiding behind a tree, quietly looking in this direction. With such a thing happening and such a huge commotion, of course, everyone was woken up. But for some reason, when the masked man looked at White Lotus, there was something different. He stared at the young girl, and after a while, he looked at the dark forest around him, once again confirming that he really did not see where Lu Chen was hiding. He seemed to sigh softly, then he pulled back his hand, turned around, put away the long sword in an instant, and flew away, instantly disappearing into the night. Like a phantom of the night, he came and went without a trace. In the forest, White Lotus slowly walked out. Oxen and Atsu stared in the direction where the masked man disappeared. After a while, suddenly, somewhere in the forest, a shadow suddenly shook, and then Lu Chen fell out of it. White Lotus and Oxen immediately ran to him, but Lu Chen put his hand on his chest, and after spitting out a mouthful of blood, he frowned and whispered to himself, "What is the sect leader's token?" Chapter 545. This sudden sneak attack came without any warning, and during this process, the masked man was obviously not an ordinary person. His attacks were fierce and decisive, but since he failed to hit his target, he did not continue to fight. After assessing the situation, he quickly left, even if he seemed to have the upper hand at that time. In fact, thinking about it, how could anyone who could cultivate to the Yuanying stage be easy to deal with? It should be known that in this world, except for those few peerless geniuses who had amazing talent and great opportunities to break through the shackles and reach the deity transformation stage, spiritual masters of Yuanying were equivalent to outstanding figures at the peak of the cultivation world. Even when Lu Chen was lurking in the Devil Sect as a shadow, he had never heard of any Yuanying stage expert in the Devil Sect who would lower himself to play the role of a killer. But this kind of thing, he actually encountered it tonight. A Yuanying stage spiritual master disguised as a killer was secretly staring at him. This kind of feeling, no matter who it was, would make them feel a chill all over their body. Lu Chen's expression was very ugly, but it could not be said that he was panicking. In fact, after the initial surprise, he quickly calmed down, and then began to treat his injuries. Atsu had already run to his side, and then Oxen and White Lotus also came over. They saw Lu Chen take out a jade bottle and swallow a panacea, then meditate on the spot for a while. Gradually, a trace of redness appeared on his face, and he opened his eyes again. Although there was still a trace of exhaustion on his face, his spirit was already a lot better. Bai Lian frowned and glanced at the jade bottle beside his hand. After a while, she let out a humph. Lu Chen looked at her, smiled, and said, "Someone gave it to me." White Lotus turned her head away and said, "It's still good to have a spiritual master. Good things are inexhaustible, and even the rarest things will be sent to me." Some people who saw this kind of thing might be envious, but for White Lotus, it was probably mixed with a kind of complicated feeling of having once obtained and then lost, difficult to express. Lu Chen didn't say anything more about this. He just calmly put away his things, got up, and left. Until now, Lu Chen still did not know the identity of the masked man who suddenly appeared and launched a sneak attack, including the words that the masked man said that the only basis was the sect leader's token. He was also puzzled. In that intense but short battle, his reaction could not be said to be slow, and his judgment could not be said to be inaccurate. But at the same time, he could not accurately determine which sect the masked man's Dao skills and supernatural powers belonged to in that instant. Perhaps the masked man was actually hiding on purpose, and only used his extremely high cultivation to launch a strong attack. From leaving the Immortal City all the way to the Western continent until now, during this long journey, although Lu Chen had a hard time, he almost did not encounter any trouble, and this was the only time that he was really in danger. Who was that masked man? What was his purpose? For the rest of the journey, Lu Chen and White Lotus changed their original plan and used a more secretive and faster method to speed up their journey. Of course, the intention was to avoid that mysterious masked man. However, the strange thing was that the masked man with extremely high cultivation actually appeared only once, and in the days after that, he did not appear again. Lu Chen, who did not dare to let his guard down, was cautious along the way, but finally he brought White Lotus, Oxen, and Black Dog back to the Immortal City without any danger. When the familiar figure of the most prosperous and greatest city without city walls in the world came into their sight from afar, whether it was Lu Chen, White Lotus, or Oxen, Black Dog, all of them subconsciously breathed a sigh of relief. This journey was indeed very long, and it made them tired, but soon, their eyes drifted to the sky. Lu Chen frowned, while White Lotus, Oxen, and Atsu, who were beside him, had a look of surprise in their eyes. The sky that enveloped the Immortal City had once again turned blood red on this day. Looking up from the ground to the sky, one could clearly see the expanse of dark red clouds that were like waves of a sea of blood as they ceaselessly roiled and rolled, causing one to shudder with fear. Most importantly, in this part of the sky, the blood-red light had long passed the midline and had now occupied about 70% of the sky. Only less than 1/3 of the clear sky was left, and it looked so narrow. Under the encirclement of the sea of blood, no one knew how long it would last. That scene even gave others the misconception that at a certain moment, or perhaps in the next moment, this bloody glow that surged like a tide would break through the boundaries of the world, break through everything, drown the entire sky, and transform the entire world into a world of blood red. Such a scene would not make people feel happy. To be exact, most people would feel very depressed when they saw it. Even though nothing strange had happened under the blood-red sky since the appearance of the blood-red light, there would naturally be many smart people who reacted to the abnormality. The elites of the cultivation world were gathered in the Immortal City, so naturally, there would be many smart people who reacted to this. When Lu Chen and his group walked towards the immortal city, they began to see people walking in the same direction as them. Some were walking alone, some were in groups of 2s and 3s, and it seemed like they were all carrying their luggage and leaving this place. Further away, on the roads leading to other directions in the immortal city, they could see many people leaving as well, and the number of people seemed to be quite large. It was a very strange feeling. Under the blood-red sky, there were so many people leaving in a hurry. However, Lu Chen and his group continued to walk towards the immortal city. With every step they took, they felt that the blood-red clouds above their heads seemed to be thicker. But fortunately, after entering the immortal city, this feeling weakened quite a bit, because along the way, they saw that there were still a lot of people in the city, and in the true Immortal Alliance on Sky Dragon Mountain, it was clear that most of the people were still very calm, as if they did not take the strange phenomenon in the sky seriously. When they saw that Lu Chen and his group had returned, the people from Fuyunji even laughed and looked happy, as if nothing had changed and everything was the same as before. Then, Lu Chen was summoned to Kunlun Hall, and only Oxen accompanied him. The black dog also followed, but Lu Chen knew that Supreme Lord Tianlan did not like this dog very much, so he asked it to wait outside the hall. As for White Lotus, it seemed like she did not want to see the bald man, so she left early. In contrast, Oxen appeared to be much more relaxed. He walked slowly into the Kunlun Hall, looking around curiously. When Supreme Lord Tianlan, who was sitting on the lotus throne, saw Lu Chen and Oxen walk in, he was obviously startled, and then he floated over to them. He first reached out to touch Oxen's head, and then with a hint of surprise, he said to Lu Chen, "Why did you bring it here?" Lu Chen was just about to say something when Perfected Lord Tianlan suddenly laughed to himself and sighed. "Apart from you, no one can force you to do anything. Forget it, it's fine if they come." He laughed, and there seemed to be some rare gratification in his eyes. It seemed that Oxen's sudden visit this time actually warmed his heart a little. Then, he turned to Lu Chen and said with a smile, "How was it? Did it go smoothly this time?" "Not smoothly," Lu Chen replied. Chapter 546. It could be seen that Perfected Lord Tianlan was a little stunned by Lu Chen's straightforward and a little crude answer. However, he was not an ordinary person after all. After being stunned for a while, he smiled and said, "You must have encountered something extraordinary for you to say that. Tell me about it." At this point, he paused for a moment as if he had thought of something. He smiled and said, "But before we chat, have you told me what you should do?" Lu Chen nodded and searched his chest. He took out a satin bag and handed it to Perfected Lord Tianlan. Perfected Lord Tianlan took it and opened the bag. A golden light shot out from the satin bag and a small golden seal landed in his hand. It was the Kunlun seal from before. Perfected Lord Tianlan held the golden seal with 2 fingers and raised it in front of his eyes. He scrutinized it for a moment. For a moment, Lu Chen noticed that the golden light on the Kunlun seal seemed to be distorted. However, it soon returned to normal as if nothing had happened. Perfected Lord Tianlan nodded as if he had confirmed something. He put the golden seal away and smiled at Lu Chen. "You did well. You didn't disappoint me." Lu Chen shrugged and said indifferently, "I've done everything you asked me to do since I was young." Perfected Lord Tianlan laughed and looked gratified. He looked at Lu Chen with satisfaction and nodded. "Well said." Oxen mooed softly and walked to a pillar at the side of the hall. Then, it lay there as if there was no one else around and yawned, looking a little sleepy. However, both Perfected Lord Tianlan and Lu Chen did not care about Oxen's actions. Oxen had been with them for a long time and its status had always been very special. "All right, tell me, what kind of trouble did you encounter along the way that made you feel that it was a little tricky?" Perfected Lord Tianlan said. "On the way back, I encountered a person who attacked me. His cultivation was very high and he was probably a perfected one who had cultivated to the Yuanying realm." Lu Chen did not beat around the bush and directly pointed out the main point to Perfected Lord Tianlan. As expected, even though Perfected Lord Tianlan's cultivation was unfathomable, his face darkened and he became somewhat serious after hearing the news. Lu Chen recounted the sneak attack that he encountered from the beginning to the end in simple words. There was almost no superfluous words, and he did not exaggerate the enemy or himself. What he said was basically the truth of that night and presented it to Perfected Lord Tianlan. After listening, Perfected Lord Tianlan did not immediately make a judgment. Instead, he pondered for a while and walked a few rounds in the hall with his hands behind his back. He then raised his head and asked Lu Chen, "When he fought you, did you recognize any clues from his sword techniques or Dao skills?" Lu Chen shook his head straightforwardly and said, "I couldn't tell. That person must have hidden his identity on purpose, but..." He paused and frowned. Perfected Lord Tianlan immediately sensed it and asked, "But what?" Lu Chen glanced at him. After a moment of hesitation, he said, "When he ambushed me, I think I heard him yell something like, 'Hand over the sect master's keepsake.'" Perfected Lord Tianlan was stunned and frowned. "Sect leader's token?" Lu Chen nodded. "Yes, that's what he said. However, I was indeed puzzled at that time because I've never had anything on me that was the sect leader's token." Perfected Lord Tianlan was speechless. He closed his eyes and pondered for a while before saying slowly, "No, I do have it." Then, he pressed his hand on his chest and pointed at Lu Chen. "The Kunlun seal that I gave you is actually the sect leader's token." The atmosphere in the Kunlun hall seemed to be a little cold. No one spoke for a long time. Oxen, who was in a distance, seemed to sense something in its sleepy state and looked over with sleepy eyes. Perhaps it was because it was lazy by nature, or perhaps it had been used to this scene for many years, but it did not seem surprised or worried. Instead, it opened its mouth and yawned, then closed its eyes again. Not long after, a faint snore could be heard. This time, it really fell asleep. In the hall, Lu Chen's expression was neither ugly nor angry, but he did not smile either. After a moment of silence, he said to Perfected Lord Tianlan, "You should have told me about this earlier." Perfected Lord Tianlan nodded and said, "Perhaps, but I really don't want to tell you about the origin of this thing." Slightly surprised, Lu Chen asked, "Why?" Perfected Lord Tianlan smiled and said, "Actually, you can more or less guess in your heart, right? Because this Kunlun seal is the token of the perfected master of our Kunlun party. It has been passed down since ancient times." Lu Chen did not say anything. After a while, he shook his head and smiled bitterly. The token of the perfected master of the Kunlun party. From this description, apart from knowing the origin of the Kunlun seal, there was actually another meaning, which was that this thing represented the perfected master of the Kunlun party. If there were no accidents, the Kunlun seal should be with the current perfected master of the Kunlun party. However, the current situation was obviously not the case. The Kunlun seal was not in the hands of the current perfected master Qian Deng of the Kunlun party. Instead, it had always been in the hands of Perfected Lord Tianlan. Moreover, when Perfected Lord Tianlan gave this token of the perfected master to Lu Chen to take back to the Kunlun mountain to work, he actually did not tell him to return the Kunlun seal to Qian Deng. The meaning of this was quite interesting. At this moment, Lu Chen was thinking about the word agent that had been with him for 3 years before the title of Perfected Master Qian Deng. And it seemed that it would be very difficult to get rid of it. He was silent for a long time. Then, he raised his head and looked at Perfected Lord Tianlan, saying, "Is there any inside information that I must know now?" Perfected Lord Tianlan thought for a while and said, "No. Perhaps I will talk to you in detail again after a period of time." But Lu Chen agreed without hesitation. It seemed that he was not interested in the twists and turns in this matter. He kept a respectful distance and said, "In that case, I will leave first." But Perfected Lord Tianlan stopped him and said, "No matter what, you were attacked. I won't let this matter rest. I'll investigate further." Lu Chen glanced at him and seemed to be a little hesitant. Finally, he said, "Do you think it was Qian Deng?" "I think it was most likely him." Perfected Lord Tianlan said straightforwardly, "There are some secrets hidden in the Kunlun seal. For many years, only a few people in the Kunlun party know about it. Therefore, it is not very famous in the sect. In fact, there are only a few people who have ulterior motives about it and know something about it." Lu Chen nodded and did not say anything. He turned around and walked to the door. However, when he was about to step over the threshold, he suddenly turned back and said to Perfected Lord Tunlun, "I just find it a little strange. Since he is so suspicious of this matter, why did he shout, 'Sect Leader's Token,' when he attacked me? Isn't that equivalent to a confession? Is Perfected Master Qian Deng really so stupid?" Perfected Lord Tianlan's expression did not change. He said lightly, "What you said makes sense. But no matter what, we have to investigate the Kunlun party." Lu Chen looked at him deeply and then nodded. Without saying anything, he turned around and walked out. You're tuning in to the Passion Pages YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.